Somewhere in a locked, climate-controlled vault in Jerusalem sit fragments of parchment that are over 2,000 years old. Torn, faded, some no bigger than a postage stamp, and buried inside their cracked Hebrew and Aramaic script are stories about beings that shouldn't exist. Giants born from unions between heavenly beings and human women. Creatures so large and so corrupt that God allegedly flooded the entire planet just to wipe them out. Now here's where things get strange. Roughly 15% of people reading this right now carry a blood type that shows up in less than 1% of the rest of the animal kingdom. No gorillas have it, no chimpanzees. Not a single other primate on Earth carries this exact genetic marker. Scientists call it Rh negative, and for decades a very persistent theory has floated around dark corners of the internet, whispered in documentaries, printed in books with dramatic red lettering on the cover. The theory says these two mysteries are actually one mystery, that Rh negative blood is a genetic leftover from the Nephilim, the giants of Genesis, and that the Dead Sea Scrolls hold the proof. It's a wild claim. It's also one of the most searched, debated, and misunderstood topics in the entire online world of ancient mysteries. So today, we're going to do something most videos on this topic refuse to do. We're going to actually open the scrolls. We're going to look at what they say, word for word, line for line, and compare that to what modern genetics actually tells us about Rh negative blood. No shortcuts, no cherry picking. Just the evidence laid out piece by piece, so you can see exactly where the ancient texts end and where speculation begins. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you up front. The Dead Sea Scrolls do talk about giants. That part is true. There are entire fragmented texts, like the Book of Giants, that describe enormous offspring born from angelic beings called the Watchers and human women. That's documented. That's real, sitting in museum cases right now. But do the scrolls mention blood types? Do they mention Rh factors, antigens, or anything resembling modern hematology? No, not once, not anywhere. The people who wrote these texts over 2,000 years ago had no concept of blood typing. That science didn't exist until 1901, when an Austrian physician named Karl Landsteiner discovered the ABO blood groups. The Rh factor itself wasn't identified until 1940. So right from the start, we're dealing with two bodies of knowledge that were never meant to touch. One is ancient theology. The other is 20th century biology. The question is whether they secretly connect underneath the surface, or whether that connection was invented much later by people looking for a bridge that was never there. That's exactly what we're investigating today. What can actually be proven from the historical record? What can be reasonably inferred by connecting the dots? And what is pure speculation dressed up to look like ancient secret knowledge? We'll walk through the biology of Rh negative blood, the actual content of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Genesis account of the Nephilim, and how these threads got tangled together into one of the internet's favourite forbidden history theories. Before we go further, I want to know where in the world you're listening from right now. Drop a comment and tell me your city and what time it is there. I read every single one, and it's honestly one of my favourite parts of doing this. Last time I checked, someone was listening at sunrise in Manila, while someone else had it playing at midnight in Lisbon. It's strange and wonderful knowing this reaches so many different corners of the planet at once. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, the best way to support what we do here is to follow the show on Spotify. That's where full episodes go up first, and if you leave a 5-star review after listening, it genuinely helps more than you'd think. Links in the description. Now let's start where this story actually begins. Thousands of years ago, with a strange and unsettling passage buried in the Book of Genesis. Let's start with the basics, because you can't evaluate a theory about blood if you don't actually understand the blood in question. And it turns out most people, Even people who know their own blood type don't really understand what Rh negative means or where it comes from. Your blood type isn't just one thing. It's actually a combination of two completely separate systems layered on top of each other. The first system is the one everybody learns in school. A bow. That's where types A, B, AB, and O come from. This system is based on sugar molecules sitting on the surface of your red blood cells. Different sugars trigger different immune reactions, which is why you can't just receive any blood from anyone. Mix the wrong types together and your immune system treats the donated blood like an invading army. But layered on top of ABO is a second, completely independent system, the Rh system, and this is where things get interesting. The Rh system is named after the rhesus monkey because that's the animal researchers were studying when they first identified it in the 1940s. Within this system, there's one particular marker that matters more than almost any other. It's called the Rhd antigen. Think of an antigen as a tiny flag planted on the surface of a blood cell, a molecular marker your immune system can recognize. If your red blood cells carry this particular Rhd flag, you're Rh positive. If they don't, if that flag is simply absent, you're Rh negative. That's it. That's the entire biological difference. It's not a different kind of blood. It's not a mutation that adds something exotic or alien. It's the absence of one specific protein marker. Roughly 85% of people worldwide have it. About 15% don't. And whether you have it or not depends entirely on which version of a single gene you inherited from your parents. Now here's something crucial to understand. Something that gets glossed over constantly in the more sensational corners of the internet. ABO and Rh are separate systems that just happen to get combined into one label. When someone says they're O negative or AB positive, they're actually describing two independent genetic traits smashed together into a single term. Being Rh negative has nothing to do with which ABO type you carry. You can be a negative, B negative, O negative, or AB negative. The negative simply means your cells are missing that Rhd flag, regardless of what sugar markers are also sitting on your blood cells. This matters because a lot of Nephilim Bloodline claims treat Rh negative like it's this singular, mystical, standalone category, as if it exists in isolation from the rest of human blood chemistry. It doesn't. It's one variable in a two-variable system, and biologically speaking, it's a pretty ordinary variable at that. So why does it matter at all? Why do doctors even bother tracking it if it's just the absence of a protein? Two reasons, and they're both intensely practical, not mystical. The first is transfusion medicine. If you're Rh negative and you receive Rh positive blood, your immune system can recognize that Rhd antigen as foreign. It doesn't happen immediately the first time, but your body starts building antibodies against it, sort of like your immune system taking notes for future reference. If you're ever exposed to Rh positive blood again, those antibodies can trigger a serious, sometimes dangerous immune reaction. That's why blood banks are so careful about matching not just ABO type, but Rh type as well before any transfusion. It's not exotic, it's basic, standard, everyday hospital protocol. The second reason is pregnancy, and this is where things get genuinely dramatic, though in a medical sense, not a mystical one. If an Rh negative mother is carrying an Rh positive baby, which can happen if the father is Rh positive, there's a risk that during pregnancy or childbirth, small amounts of the baby's blood can mix with the mother's. Her immune system encountering that Rhd antigen for potentially the first time can start producing antibodies against it. This usually isn't dangerous for that first pregnancy. But if she becomes pregnant again with another Rh positive baby, those antibodies can cross the placenta and attack the baby's red blood cells. This condition is called Rh disease, or hemolytic disease of the newborn, and before modern medicine figured out how to prevent it, it could be genuinely life-threatening. Today, this risk is managed with a treatment called Rogum, an injection that essentially stops the mother's immune system from building those antibodies in the first place. It's routine. It's proven. It's given to Rh-negative mothers around the world every single day without controversy, without mystery, without anyone whispering about ancient bloodlines in the delivery room. So here's the honest, unglamorous truth about Rh-negative blood. It is a well-documented, well-understood genetic trait, governed by ordinary inheritance patterns relevant primarily in two very specific and very medical contexts, transfusions and pregnancy. That's the whole story, at least the story modern hematology tells. But if it's really this ordinary, why does it feel so mysterious to so many people? Why has this one blood trait become the centre of internet forums, documentaries and theories about ancient hybrid bloodlines? Part of the answer is simple statistics. 15% isn't common enough to feel normal, but it's not rare enough to be dismissed either. It sits in this strange in-between zone where people notice it, ask questions about it, and start looking for explanations beyond basic genetics. Add in a few genuinely unusual medical complications, like the pregnancy risks we just covered, and you have a trait that feels different, even dangerous, even though the danger has a completely mundane biological explanation. Combine that unease with humanity's endless appetite for hidden origins and secret bloodlines, and you've got the perfect ingredients for a mystery to grow around something that, biologically speaking, isn't mysterious at all. But to really understand how this specific trait became linked to ancient giants and forbidden lineages, we need to look at how it was discovered in the first place, and more importantly, what happened in the decades after that discovery when the science met the myths. The story begins with a medical mystery, not an ancient mystery, not a Dead Sea Scroll mystery, a hospital mystery. In 1939, a doctor named Philip Levine and his colleague Rufus Stetson were investigating a case involving a woman who had given birth to a stillborn baby. After the delivery, she received a blood transfusion from her husband. On paper, the blood should have been compatible. Their ABO types matched. But her body reacted violently. Her immune system attacked the transfused cells, and the researchers found antibodies in her blood that reacted not only with her husband's red blood cells, but with the baby's cells as well. Something was there. Some blood marker outside the familiar ABO system. A molecular flag that doctors had not yet properly identified. At the time, this was huge. ABO blood typing had already transformed medicine. Before it, transfusions were basically roulette. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes the patient died. The discovery of A, B, AB and O types had made blood transfusion dramatically safer. But cases like this showed that ABO was not the whole story. Human blood carried other markers, other ways for one immune system to recognize another person's cells as foreign. Then in 1940, the Austrian-born scientist Karl Landsteiner, working with Alexander Wiener, published an experiment that gave this hidden factor its famous name. They took red blood cells from Rhesus macaques, a species of monkey used in laboratory research, and injected them into rabbits and guinea pigs. The animals' immune systems produced antibodies against the monkey cells. When Landsteiner and Wiener tested those antibodies against human blood samples, they found something surprising. The antibodies reacted with the red blood cells of about 85% of the people they tested. They named the newly identified reaction factor Rh, short for Rhesus. And that name has caused confusion ever since. Because when people hear Rh factor, they naturally assume it means humans with Rh-positive blood inherited something from Rhesus monkeys, or they hear that Rh-negative people lack the factor, and conclude they must be missing some ancient primate trait. And from there, the speculation can get strange fast. If positive people have monkey blood, the theory goes maybe negative people came from somewhere else. Maybe they are not fully human. Maybe their blood carries the trace of angels, giants, Nephilim, aliens, or a lost civilization. But that entire chain of reasoning starts with a misunderstanding of a 1940 laboratory label. The factor was named after rhesus monkeys because rhesus monkey cells were used in the experiment. That's all. It was a naming decision, not an ancestry claim. Not a declaration that one human blood type came from monkeys while another did not. Not evidence that Rh-negative people represent a separate branch of humanity. Think about it like this. If scientists discover a new drug while studying mice, the drug does not become proof that humans descended from mice in some special way. The animal used in an experiment can give a discovery its name without explaining the evolutionary history of the thing being studied. Medical science is full of names like this. Names based on where something was first found, who first described it, what animal was used in testing, or sometimes just what sounded useful at the time. But the Rh story is even more complicated than that. The antibodies Landsteiner and Wiener produced using rhesus monkey blood were not a perfect match for the antigen doctors now call RHD. They reacted with a related pattern, but the early experiments were not identifying the human Rh system with the precision modern genetics allows. The name stuck anyway, and over time Rh factor became the everyday shorthand for the most clinically important human antigen in the Rh blood group system, the D antigen. That system is not a single mysterious substance. It is a complex family of proteins on red blood cells. Modern science recognizes dozens of Rh antigens created by genes in the human genome, especially genes called RHD and RHCE. The D antigen is just the one that matters most in routine transfusion medicine and pregnancy care, because it can provoke a powerful immune response. So, when a doctor says someone is Rh positive, they usually mean that person expresses the D antigen. When they say Rh negative, they mean the D antigen is absent from that person's red cells. That is a medical classification. It is not a map of ancient descent. And this distinction matters more than it might seem. Because people love names. A name feels like a clue. Rhesus sounds loaded. It sounds evolutionary. It sounds like it points backward through time toward monkeys, toward human origins, toward the dividing line between ordinary humanity and something else. And when you combine that name with the real medical drama of Rh incompatibility in pregnancy, you get a story that almost writes itself. Rh negative mothers can develop antibodies against an Rh positive fetus. Their immune systems can treat the baby's blood cells as foreign. That sounds, at first hearing, almost impossible. A mother rejecting her own child. A biological conflict between two bloodlines. And for someone already looking for hidden meanings, it can feel like evidence that Rh-negative women are somehow incompatible with the rest of humanity. But again, the reality is more ordinary and more fascinating in its own way. The immune system is not reading family trees. It is not deciding who is human and who is not. It is detecting a particular molecular marker. If it sees a marker it has learned to recognize as foreign, it responds. The same basic logic applies to transfusions, organ transplants, infections, and allergies. Immune systems are extremely powerful, but they are not historians. They do not preserve memories of fallen angels. The old terminology makes this easier to misunderstand because 20th century medicine was still building its language as it made discoveries. Researchers often gave things provisional names before they fully understood what they had found. They grouped blood reactions by how antibodies behaved in a test tube. They argued over competing naming systems. One system used letters. Another used combinations like C, C, D, E, and E. Some terms survived because doctors had already begun using them not because they perfectly described the biology. Rh factor is one of those surviving terms: useful, familiar, historically important, but imperfect. And imperfect names are fertile ground for conspiracy claims. Take a partial truth, strip away the context, and let imagination do the rest. Scientists used rhesus monkeys in early experiments. True, the Rh system was named after those experiments. Also true, Rh-negative people lack the D antigen. True again. Then comes the leap. Therefore, Rh-negative people are missing a monkey-derived trait. Therefore, they are genetically separate. Therefore, they must descend from Nephilim. That leap is not science. It is a story built in the gap between a name and its meaning. All modern humans share deep evolutionary ancestry with other primates. That includes Rh-positive people. That includes Rh-negative people. The presence or absence of the D antigen does not divide humanity into separate origins. It reflects variation within one species, shaped by inheritance, population history, and chance over many generations. You can trace the genes involved. You can see how versions of those genes are passed from parents to children. You can study where different Rh variants are more common. What you cannot do is look at an Rh label and extract a secret genealogy from the Bronze Age, much less from the world before the flood. Blood typing tells doctors how to keep a transfusion safe. It can help manage a pregnancy. In some limited cases, it can contribute to understanding population patterns. But it cannot identify angelic ancestry. It cannot detect giant blood. It cannot reveal whether a person belongs to a hidden biblical bloodline. That does not mean ancient people had no ideas about descent, purity, inheritance, or sacred lineage. They absolutely did. The Bible is full of genealogies. Ancient kings claimed divine favor. Entire communities define themselves through ancestry and covenant. But those are cultural and religious systems of identity. They are not the same thing as modern hematology. And once we separate those two worlds, something becomes much clearer. The Rh factor has a real history, a dramatic history, a history of difficult births, dangerous transfusions, laboratory animals, antibodies, and scientists trying to decode the invisible chemistry of human blood. But its name is not a hidden confession. It is not an evolutionary riddle. And it is not a breadcrumb trail leading from rhesus monkeys to Nephilim giants. To understand why Rh-negative status appears more often in some populations than others, we have to leave the laboratory name behind and look at the genetics underneath it. At the center of the Rh story is a gene called RhD. This gene contains the instructions for making the D antigen, the marker on red blood cells that determines whether someone is usually called Rh positive or Rh negative. If your red cells display the D antigen, you are Rh positive. If they do not, you are Rh negative. Simple enough. But the way that trait is inherited is where people often start seeing patterns that feel mysterious. The basic version goes like this. Every person inherits 2 copies of most genes, one from their mother and one from their father. In the simplified model used in biology classrooms, we can call the version associated with the D antigen D, and the version that does not produce the antigen D. If you inherit at least one D, you will usually be Rh positive. So someone with DD is Rh positive. Someone with DD is also Rh positive. The D antigen is present in both cases, but someone with DD is Rh negative, because neither inherited copy produces the usual D antigen. Think of it like a pair of instructions for putting a flag on the surface of your red blood cells. One working instruction is usually enough. If you inherit one copy that says put up the flag, your body puts up the flag, Rh positive. But if both copies fail to provide that instruction, the flag is absent, or Rh negative. That means two Rh negative parents will generally have Rh negative children. Why? Because in the simplified model, each Rh negative parent has the DD combination. They can only pass on D, one parent contributes D. The other parent contributes D. The child gets DD. Rh negative plus Rh negative produces Rh negative. That part is completely predictable, and it is one reason people sometimes talk about Rh negative status as though it marks a sealed-off family line. A community where Rh negative people marry mostly within the group can, over generations, have many Rh negative children. The pattern can look striking. It can feel like a biological signature being carefully preserved. But a recurring trait is not automatically evidence of a unique origin. It is evidence that genes are being inherited, and the next part is where the mystery usually deepens. Two Rh positive parents can have an Rh negative child. At first, this seems impossible. If both parents are positive, shouldn't every child be positive too? Not necessarily. Remember, Rh positive does not tell you exactly which two versions of the gene a person carries. A person may be DD, carrying two copies associated with D antigen expression, or they may be DD, carrying 1D and 1D. Both people test Rh positive. Both have the antigen, but genetically they are not identical. Now picture two Rh positive parents who are both DD. Each one has a visible Rh positive blood type because each has 1D. But each also carries a D version that can be passed to a child. For every pregnancy, the mother can pass D or D, the father can pass D or D. There are 4 basic combinations. The child could receive D from both parents, DD, Rh positive. The child could receive D from the mother and D from the father, DD, Rh positive. Or D from the mother and D from the father, also DD, Rh positive. But there is one more possibility. The child receives D from both parents, DD Rh negative. So when two DD parents have a child, there is in this simplified model a 1 in 4 chance of an Rh negative child with each pregnancy. Not one chance divided across all their children. Not a cosmic quota that gets used up after the first birth. Each pregnancy is a new roll of the genetic dice. A couple might have 4 Rh positive children in a row. Another couple with the same genetic combination might have 1 Rh neg child first. Probability describes patterns across many births. It does not write the script for one particular family. And that is important, because a surprising Rh negative child has sometimes been treated as proof of some hidden event. Secret ancestry, a missing father, an ancient bloodline suddenly resurfacing after centuries underground. Usually it means 2 Rh positive parents. Each carried a version of the gene they did not visibly express. That is not an anomaly. That is standard inheritance. Of course, real genetics is messier than the classroom chart. The neat D and D model is useful because it explains the central pattern. But the Rh blood group system is not actually controlled by one clean on-off switch. The Rhd gene itself can vary in multiple ways. In many populations of European ancestry, Rhd negative status commonly results because the Rhd gene is missing entirely. No Rhd gene, no usual D antigen on the red cells, but in other populations a person may test Rh negative for different genetic reasons. The gene may be present but altered. It may produce a D antigen so weakly that routine testing reacts differently. It may produce a partial version of the antigen, with some features present and others absent. There are also rare situations involving neighbouring genes, unusual gene arrangements, and laboratory interpretation. This is why online inheritance charts have limits. They are not useless. They can explain the basic logic beautifully. But they often present a complex blood group system, as if it were a single letter passed through a family like eye colour in an old textbook. In real clinical medicine, blood banks do not rely on internet Punnett squares when a patient needs a transfusion or when a pregnancy may involve Rh incompatibility. They test the blood. Sometimes they perform more detailed antigen testing. In complicated cases, they can look directly at the underlying DNA. Because what matters medically is not just the family story. It is which antigens are actually present and whether the immune system may react to them. There is another complication people often miss. Rh positive and Rh negative are shorthand labels. They are useful, but they compress a huge amount of biology into one word. The wider Rh system includes many antigens beyond D, including C, E, and E. Two people can both be called Rh positive and still differ in other Rh markers relevant to transfusion medicine. Two people can both be Rh negative in the everyday sense and still have different genetic explanations for that result. So the label tells us something real. It just does not tell us everything. And it definitely does not tell us who someone's ancestors were thousands of years ago. This is the point where the Nephilim theory tries to turn inheritance into revelation. Rh negative parents have Rh negative children. Rh positive parents can sometimes carry the hidden version. Therefore, the argument goes, Rh negative blood must be an ancient trait passed down from a separate people, perhaps survivors of some forbidden union between humans and divine beings. But every inherited human trait has ancestors. That is what inherited means. A gene version persists because people who carried it had children, and some of those children carried it too. The fact that a trait can move quietly through families for generations does not make it supernatural. It makes it genetic. A recessive trait can seem to disappear and reappear, because the relevant gene version may be carried by people who do not express it. That can create the illusion of a hidden bloodline waiting to reveal itself. But geneticists do not need fallen angels, giants, or secret post-flood survivors to explain it. The ordinary mathematics of inheritance already explains the pattern, and ordinary does not mean uninteresting. In fact, the real question is more compelling. If Rh negative status is inherited through normal human genetics, why is it common in some places and rare in others? Why do certain populations show higher frequencies of the variants associated with Rh negative blood? Is that the result of migration, isolation, chance, natural selection, or some combination of all four? That is where the story leaves individual families behind and opens onto the map of human population history. Look at a modern map of Rh negative blood, and the distribution is not smooth. It does not spread evenly across humanity like sunlight across a field. It rises in some populations, drops sharply in others, and sometimes changes dramatically across regions that are geographically close together. In broad terms, ROP negative status is most common in parts of Europe and in populations with substantial European ancestry. In many European populations, roughly 10 to 20% of people are RO negative. In some communities, the frequency is higher still. The Basque population of northern Spain and southwestern France is often mentioned because Rh negative status has historically been reported there at notably high levels, sometimes around 25% or more depending on the sample and the exact population being studied. That number gets attention fast, 1 person in 4. A trait that is uncommon across most of the world appearing in a large share of one population. For anyone already looking for a hidden story, this can feel like the first crack in the wall. Why there? Why that region? Why would a blood type be concentrated among a people with their own ancient language, deep regional identity, and a history that seems to reach back before many of their neighbours? This is where speculation starts moving. Some writers point to the Basques and say they must be remnants of an older race. Others connect them to Atlantis, to Cro-Magnons, to the lost tribes of Israel, to survivors of some prehistoric catastrophe. And in the Nephilim version of the story, high Rh negative frequency becomes a clue. Not proof exactly, but a clue supposedly pointing toward an ancient non-human bloodline preserved in isolated mountain communities. It is a dramatic idea, but population genetics offers a much less supernatural explanation, and honestly a much more realistic one. Genes do not distribute themselves according to mythology. They move through populations by birth, migration, marriage, isolation and chance. Imagine a small community forming thousands of years ago. Maybe a few families settle in a valley protected by mountains. Maybe a group becomes culturally distinct and tends to marry within its own community. Maybe war, geography, language, religion, or simple distance limits contact with outsiders. Now imagine that several of the original founders happen to carry the genetic variants associated with Rh negative blood, not because they were giants, not because their ancestors came from the sky, just because every human population contains genetic variation, and the people who happened to establish this community carried a particular version at an unusual frequency. That is called a founder effect. A founder effect happens when a new population begins with a relatively small number of individuals. The genes those people carry become the starting deck for everyone who comes after them. If the founding group had an unusually high frequency of a gene variant, their descendants may continue to show that pattern for generations. Think of it like reaching into a giant jar filled with red and white marbles. The entire jar represents a much larger population. Maybe only a small percentage of the marbles are white, but if you scoop out a small handful by chance, you could end up with more white marbles than expected. Now that handful becomes the population of a new village. Their children inherit the same limited sample. Their grandchildren inherit it too. If the village stays relatively isolated, the unusual pattern can persist. Over time, it may even become more pronounced. That is not evidence that the white marbles came from another species. It is evidence that chance matters more than people realize. Genetic drift can make this effect even stronger. Genetic drift is one of those phrases that sounds technical but describes something very simple. In smaller populations, gene frequencies can rise or fall just because some people happen to have more children than others. A gene does not need to be better. It does not need to provide a special survival advantage. It may become common because the people carrying it survived a famine, escaped a war, migrated to a new territory, or simply had larger families. Over enough generations, luck becomes ancestry, and ancestry becomes a pattern on a map. This is especially important when talking about Rh negative blood, because the genetic cause is not identical everywhere. In many populations of European ancestry, Rh negative status commonly results from deletion of the RhD gene. The relevant genetic instruction is absent, so the usual D antigen is not produced. But in African, Asian and indigenous populations, people who test Rh negative may sometimes have different underlying genetic changes. The RhD gene may be altered rather than completely missing. It may produce a weak D or partial D form that does not fit neatly into the simple positive-negative categories used in everyday conversation. So even the phrase Rh negative can hide multiple genetic histories. Two people in different parts of the world may share the same blood typing label, without sharing the exact same mutation, the same ancestry, or the same route through history. That matters, because maps can be misleading. A map makes a trait look like a border, a dark-coloured region here, a pale-coloured region there. It makes people imagine ancient nations, sealed bloodlines, separate origins. But human populations have never been frozen in place. Europe itself was shaped by repeated migrations. Hunter-gatherer groups moved after the Ice Age. Early farmers entered from Anatolia. Steppe pastoralists spread across huge distances during the Bronze Age. Romans, Germanic peoples, Slavs, Vikings, Arabs, Mongols, merchants, soldiers, refugees, enslaved people, and entire displaced communities crossed the continent over thousands of years. Every movement mixed genes. Every period of isolation preserved some differences. The Rh negative pattern seen in Europe today is not a fossilized message from one vanished people. It is the accumulated result of all those movements, all those bottlenecks, all those marriages, all those communities that grew, split apart, disappeared, or absorbed their neighbours. And outside Europe, Rh negative status is generally much less common, especially in many East Asian populations, where the usual Rh negative phenotype is rare. In some East Asian samples, it appears in well under 1% of people. That contrast can look almost too sharp to be ordinary. If Rh negative blood is common enough in parts of Europe to appear in 1 out of every 6 or 7 people, but rare in other regions, surely that means something bigger is going on. It does mean something. It means human history happened differently in different places. Different populations began with different gene frequencies. Different groups passed through different population bottlenecks. Different communities mixed with neighbours at different rates. Some expanded rapidly, some remained more isolated. Some were nearly wiped out and rebuilt from a small number of survivors. When population size collapses, rare variants can become common by accident. When a population expands, those variants spread with it. When groups mix, frequencies shift again. This is not mysterious in the sense of requiring supernatural ancestry, but it is mysterious in the older, better sense of the word. It reminds us that every population carries the marks of journeys we can only partly reconstruct. And there is one more question people often ask. If Rh negative status can create a serious pregnancy incompatibility under certain conditions, why was it not eliminated long ago? That question sounds like a challenge to the ordinary genetic explanation. If the trait caused problems, shouldn't evolution have removed it? Not necessarily. First, Rh incompatibility does not affect every Rh negative person. It becomes medically important only in a specific situation, usually an Rh negative mother carrying an Rh positive fetus, followed by maternal sensitization. Even then, the major dangers are often associated with later pregnancies, not necessarily the first. Before modern medicine, the effect would have been real, but not every pregnancy involving Rh negative blood would have ended badly. Second, natural selection is not a perfect engineer. It does not remove every trait that carries a possible cost, especially when that cost depends on a particular pairing, particular pregnancies, and particular immune events. And third, the persistence of a gene variant does not automatically mean it was selected for. Sometimes a trait remains because it is neutral enough. Sometimes it travels along with other genetic changes. Sometimes it becomes common simply because history dealt the dice that way. That answer can feel less satisfying than a secret bloodline. A secret bloodline gives people a story with heroes, survivors, hidden knowledge, and a reason why they are different. Population genetics gives us migration routes, statistical probabilities, and founder effects. But the real story is not small. A blood type map is a map of human movement. It records isolation without proving purity. It records inheritance without revealing destiny. It can show where certain variants became common, but it cannot tell us that the people carrying them came from heaven, survived a race of giants, or descended from beings outside humanity. Geographic concentration is a fact. The meaning assigned to it is something else entirely. And nowhere does that distinction matter more than in pregnancy, where Rh-negative blood can produce an immune reaction so strange, so specific, and so emotionally powerful that people have spent decades asking whether ordinary biology is really enough to explain it. That question brings us to the part of the Rh story that feels genuinely strange. Not strange in the sense that it breaks biology. Strange in the sense that biology can sometimes seem almost personal. An Rh-negative woman can carry an Rh-positive child. Her body can support that pregnancy, nourish the fetus, build the placenta, and bring the baby close to birth. But under certain circumstances, a tiny exchange of blood between mother and fetus can change what happens next. The mother's immune system may encounter the D antigen carried on the fetus's red blood cells. And because her own red blood cells do not carry that antigen, her immune system may recognize it as foreign. This is called Reich incompatibility. The basic setup is simple. The mother is Rh negative. The fetus is Rh positive, usually because the father is Rh positive and passes on an RhD gene variant associated with the D antigen. But simple does not mean harmless. During pregnancy, maternal and fetal blood are usually kept mostly separate by the placenta. They are not supposed to flow together like two rivers joining. The placenta is more like a heavily guarded border, allowing oxygen, nutrients, and waste products to pass while keeping most blood cells on their own side. But borders are not perfect. A small amount of fetal blood can enter the mother's circulation during childbirth. It can also happen during a miscarriage, an ectopic pregnancy, abdominal trauma, bleeding during pregnancy, certain medical procedures, or sometimes with no obvious event at all. If fetal Rh-positive red cells enter the bloodstream of an Rh-negative mother, her immune system may respond by making antibodies against the D antigen. That process is called sensitization, and the first time it happens, there may be no obvious crisis. This is one reason the condition became surrounded by confusion. A woman might have a healthy first Rh-positive baby. Nothing seems wrong. Then later, in another pregnancy with another Rh-positive fetus, the danger appears. Because the mother's immune system remembers, that is what immune systems are built to do. They learn from past encounters, they create antibodies and memory cells, so that if the same foreign marker appears again, they can react faster and more powerfully. Normally that memory protects us from infection. In this case, it can create a problem for a future fetus. If an Rh-negative mother has been sensitized, and she becomes pregnant again with an Rh-positive child, her anti-D antibodies can cross the placenta. Unlike red blood cells, certain maternal antibodies are meant to cross. They provide the developing baby with temporary immune protection, but anti-D antibodies do not protect an Rh-positive fetus. They can attach to the fetus's red blood cells and mark them for destruction. The result is called hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn, sometimes shortened to HDFN. In older medical language it was often called erythroblastosis fetalis. The name sounds technical. The reality can be severe. Red blood cells carry oxygen, destroy too many of them, and the fetus develops anemia. The body tries desperately to compensate, producing immature red blood cells at a frantic rate. In serious cases, the fetus can develop heart failure, dangerous swelling known as hydrops fetalis, brain injury from severe jaundice after birth, or death before delivery. For families who experienced this before effective prevention existed, it was not an abstract genetics lesson. It was a tragedy that could repeat itself. A first child born healthy, a later pregnancy ending in miscarriage or stillbirth, a newborn becoming yellow with jaundice, weak from anemia, fighting for oxygen. Parents watching doctors perform emergency transfusions with technologies that, at the time, could seem almost miraculous. And this is the detail that captures people's imaginations. An Rh-negative mother can carry a child whose blood carries a marker that her own immune system may eventually attack. To some people, that feels unnatural. They ask, why would a mother's body reject her own child? Why would human reproduction contain a mechanism that appears to turn mother against fetus? And if this is so dangerous, why would Rh-negative blood exist at all? Those are understandable questions, but they do not point to an alien bloodline. They point to the complicated reality of immune systems, inheritance, and pregnancy. The immune system does not know the story of the fetus. It does not know who the father was, what the family believes, or whether a child is wanted and loved. It recognizes molecular patterns. The D antigen is one such pattern. If the mother lacks it and becomes exposed to it through fetal blood cells, her body can form antibodies. That is not evidence that the fetus is non-human. It is evidence that two humans can inherit different versions of a normal blood group system. In fact, pregnancy-related immune conflict is not unique to the Rh factor. The ABO blood group system can also produce maternal-fetal incompatibilities, though these are often milder and behave differently. Many other maternal antibodies can affect pregnancy as well. Reproduction is not a perfectly frictionless process. It is a biological negotiation between genetically related but not genetically identical bodies. The fetus carries half its genes from the mother and half from the father. It is not an invader, but immunologically it is not a perfect duplicate of the mother either. That distinction is enough to create rare but real medical problems. And here is where modern medicine changes the entire story. Doctors can prevent most Rh sensitization through anti-D immunoglobulin treatment. This treatment is often known by a brand name many people recognize, Rogam, though different products and names are used in different countries. Anti-D immunoglobulin contains antibodies that bind to any Rh-positive fetal red blood cells that may have entered the mother's blood. Think of it like a cleanup crew arriving before the mother's immune system has time to study the evidence. The treatment helps remove those fetal cells before her own immune system becomes sensitized and begins building a long-term antibody response. It is commonly given during pregnancy, often around the 3rd trimester, and again after delivery if the newborn is confirmed to be Rh positive. It may also be given after bleeding, miscarriage, abortion, trauma, or procedures that could allow fetal blood cells into maternal circulation. This one medical intervention transformed outcomes. Before preventive anti-D treatment became standard, Rh disease was a major cause of fetal and newborn illness and death in many countries. Today, when prenatal care is available and guidelines are followed, most cases can be prevented. And if sensitization has already happened, doctors can monitor the pregnancy closely. They can measure maternal antibody levels, assess fetal anemia, and in severe cases perform blood transfusions before birth. So yes, Rh incompatibility is real. It can be serious. Historically, it could be devastating, but the extraordinary conclusion does not follow from the ordinary fact. A real medical mystery is not automatically evidence of non-human ancestry. A dangerous pregnancy complication is not proof that Rh-negative people descended from fallen angels, Nephilim, extraterrestrials, or some forgotten species outside the human family. That leap happens because the condition feels emotionally powerful. It seems to tell a story of two bloodlines that do not belong together. But biology tells a different story. It tells us that blood groups vary, that immune systems remember, that pregnancy creates unusual pathways of contact between two genetically distinct individuals. and that a condition once feared as fate can now often be prevented with a carefully designed treatment. The mystery is real, the alien conclusion is not. And that difference matters, because once blood becomes a symbol of hidden ancestry, it is easy to stop asking what the evidence actually says, and start hearing ancient texts say things they never said at all. And that brings us to Genesis, because if someone wants to connect Reich-negative blood to the Nephilim, this is usually where the trail begins. Not with a medical journal, not with a genetic study, with 4 verses in one of the oldest and most influential texts in human history. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The passage appears just before the flood story. Humanity is multiplying. The daughters of men are described as beautiful. The sons of God see them take wives from among them, and children are born. Then comes the line that has launched thousands of arguments. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That is it. No detailed physical description, no genealogy, no explanation of what kind of beings the Nephilim were. No list of their descendants, no account of a special blood group moving through history. Just a few lines, and yet those few lines became one of the most discussed passages in the Bible, because every phrase is loaded. Start with, sons of God, who were they? The Hebrew phrase is Bene Elohim. In some parts of the Hebrew Bible, similar language refers to heavenly beings, members of a divine court, beings who stand before God. The book of Job, for example, uses sons of God in a context that sounds distinctly celestial, that led many ancient Jewish interpreters to conclude that Genesis 6 is describing heavenly beings descending, taking human women, and producing extraordinary offspring. In that reading, the Nephilim are not ordinary humans. They are connected to a forbidden crossing between the heavenly and human worlds. It is dramatic, it is disturbing, and it fits the sense that something has gone badly wrong in the world just before the flood. But that is not the only interpretation. Later Jewish and Christian readers often took a different path. Some argued that the sons of God were not angels at all. They were the descendants of Seth, the son of Adam and Eve associated with a godly line. The daughters of men, in this view, were descendants of Cain, associated with a less faithful human line. The story becomes one of intermarriage, moral collapse, and the breakdown of a sacred boundary within humanity. Others argued that the sons of God were powerful human rulers. Kings, warriors, aristocrats, men who claimed divine status and took whatever women they wanted. In that interpretation, Genesis is condemning tyranny. The powerful saw, desired, took, and produced a violent society filled with famous warriors. Same 4 verses, completely different worlds, angels and humans, Sethites and Cainites, kings and subjects. And Genesis itself does not stop to settle the argument. That silence is part of the reason the passage has such a long afterlife. The text gives readers just enough material to build a theory, but not enough to close the case. Then there is the word Nephilim itself. It is often translated as giants, especially in older English Bibles. That translation came partly from ancient Greek versions of the Hebrew Scriptures, which used a word associated with giants. And later biblical passages connect the Nephilim with imposing peoples and terrifying size. But the Hebrew term is uncertain. It may be related to a verb meaning to fall, which has led some readers to call them fallen ones, maybe fallen from heaven, maybe fallen in battle, maybe violent people who make others fall, maybe something else entirely. The word appears so rarely that certainty becomes difficult. And notice what Genesis actually says. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Then these were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. At first glance that sounds simple. The Nephilim are the children. The children become mighty men. The mighty men become famous. But even here, the grammar leaves room for debate. Is Genesis saying the Nephilim were the offspring of these unions? Probably that is how many readers have understood it. But the sentence can also be read as placing the Nephilim in the background. They were already on earth in those days, while these unions produced mighty men of renown. The relationship is strongly suggested, but the passage is not written like a modern scientific report with categories, definitions, and a family tree. It is ancient narrative, compressed, symbolic, ominous. Think about the setting. Genesis 6 is not pausing to give us a biology lesson. It is accelerating toward catastrophe. Human numbers are increasing. Boundaries are being crossed. Violence is spreading. God sees that human wickedness has become great on the earth. And then comes the flood. The Nephilim appear in that atmosphere like a flash of lightning on a dark horizon. You see them for a second. Then the storm begins. That is why people have filled in the gaps for centuries. What did they look like? Were they enormous? Were they warriors? Were they divine human hybrids? Did they survive the flood? Did their bloodline continue through later giant clans? Did some hidden trait pass through certain families, kingdoms, or nations? Once those questions begin, the short passage becomes an open door. But now we need to be precise. Genesis 6 does not mention blood types. It does not mention Rh-negative blood. It does not mention the Rh factor, the D antigen, red blood cells, inherited immune markers, chromosomes, or a surviving genetic signature. It does not say that a rare human trait proves descent from the Nephilim. It does not say that certain people carry angelic blood. It does not identify any modern population as descendants of these figures. Those ideas come much later. They are attempts to connect an ancient mystery to a modern biological fact, and the connection can feel persuasive because both subjects involve blood, ancestry, unusual traits, and the possibility of hidden descent. But feeling connected is not the same as being connected. The Genesis passage gives us a mystery. It does not give us a blood test. Still, the mystery was powerful enough to survive for millennia. Ancient Jewish writers expanded it. Early Christian thinkers argued over it. Medieval traditions turned it into legends of giants and fallen angels. Modern books, websites, and conspiracy theories merged it with genetics, archaeology, extraterrestrials, royal families, and secret history. 4 verses became a universe, and the story does not end in Genesis. Because later biblical books return to giant peoples, ancient enemies, and terrifying memories from the land beyond the wilderness. They give the Nephilim a longer shadow, and make the question of survival even more complicated. And that is exactly where the trail leads next, beyond the flood. Because if Genesis says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, then the obvious question is unavoidable. Afterward, when? After the flood? And if so, how? The Bible never gives one clean, universally accepted answer. Instead, it gives us fragments, reports from frightened spies, lists of defeated peoples, old place names, a king with a famously enormous bed, memories of ancient enemies described in language designed to make them feel larger than life. The first major return comes in the book of Numbers. Israel is standing at the edge of Canaan. Moses sends 12 scouts into the land to see what lies ahead. They return carrying evidence of extraordinary fertility, grapes so heavy they need to be carried on a pole between 2 men. The land is rich, productive, worth having. But then the report turns dark. The people who dwell in the land are strong, the spies say. The cities are fortified and very large, and then comes the detail that freezes the entire camp with fear. We saw the descendants of Anak there, the Anakim, a people associated with Anak described as unusually large and formidable. The spies go even further. They say they saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim, and compared to them, they say, we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. That is one of the most famous giant passages in the Bible. And notice what it is. It is not a neutral census report. It is the testimony of men who are terrified. They have entered a land occupied by powerful populations. They have seen fortified cities, organized defenses, and people who look physically imposing. They believe conquest is impossible. Their language rises with their fear. The cities reach to heaven. The inhabitants are enormous. We are grasshoppers. That does not automatically mean the Anakim were imaginary. Ancient people absolutely could recognize that some groups included unusually tall, intimidating warriors. Height matters in war, size matters. A 6'6" fighter standing over farmers with bronze weapons and military experience could become a giant in communal memory very quickly. But we were grasshoppers is not a measurement. It is the language of panic. And the story itself makes that clear. 2 of the 12 spies, Caleb and Joshua, reject the conclusion. They do not deny that the land is defended. They deny that the defenders are unbeatable. The conflict is not simply about anatomy. It is about courage, faith, and whether fear will define reality. Still, the phrase is there. The Anakim are connected to the Nephilim. For readers who believe Genesis 6 describes beings destroyed by the flood, that creates a problem. How can the Nephilim appear again in numbers generations after Noah? One answer is that some Nephilim survived, maybe through Noah's family. Maybe, according to later speculation, through one of the wives aboard the ark. This idea appears in various traditional and modern discussions, but it is important to say what the biblical text does not say. Genesis never tells us that Noah's wife, his sons' wives, or any other survivor carried Nephilim ancestry. That is a proposed solution to a gap, not a stated fact. Another answer is that Nephilim became a name people used for terrifyingly large warrior clans. Not necessarily the exact same beings from before the flood, but a word loaded with old dread, like saying they were monsters, or they were giants. A later generation reaches for the biggest name it knows. A third possibility is that biblical traditions from different periods have been placed beside each other without being reduced to one technical genealogy. Genesis preserves one ancient and mysterious tradition. Numbers preserves another tradition about Canaan's feared inhabitants. The shared word Nephilim connects them in the final text, but it may not function like a modern family record. Then Deuteronomy adds even more names: the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, the Anakim. It can feel like opening an ancient map filled with the ruins of vanished giant nations. Deuteronomy describes the Rephaim as a people great and many and tall, comparable to the Anakim. It says the Moabites called one group the Emim, the Ammonites called another group the Zamzumim. Different peoples, different territories, different names, but all tied to the memory of unusual size and ancient strength. And then there is Og of Bashan. Og is introduced as the last remnant of the Rephaim, a king ruling east of the Jordan. Deuteronomy gives a detail so strange it has survived in the imagination for thousands of years. Og's bed, or possibly his sarcophagus, was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Depending on which ancient cubit you use, that is roughly 13 feet long and nearly 6 feet wide. A gigantic bed. But does a gigantic bed prove a gigantic man? Not necessarily. It could be royal display. Kings do not sleep in ordinary furniture if they can afford monuments. It could be a ceremonial object. The Hebrew word can refer to a bed, but some scholars have suggested an ancient stone coffin or burial structure. Bashan-Og's region was known for its basalt architecture, making that possibility worth considering. But even if it was a literal bed, the text does not tell us Og was 13 feet tall. A king might own a bed far larger than his body. Still, the point of the description is obvious. Og is meant to feel enormous. He is the final echo of a race from the old world. A ruler so imposing that his furniture becomes evidence. A giant reduced to a relic, and that tells us something important about these passages. Ancient warfare is not remembered like a spreadsheet. It is remembered through fear. The enemy is strong. Their cities are impossible. Their warriors are too tall. Their ancestors were ancient. Their kings slept in beds too large for normal men. The story makes the obstacle feel overwhelming because overcoming it is the point. That does not mean every detail is false. It means the literary purpose matters. Biblical accounts of conquest, like war traditions around the world, use size and ancestry to express danger. To call an enemy a descendant of giants is to say, these are not ordinary opponents. They are the old terror still living in the land. And yet the Bible's own giant traditions are not completely consistent. Joshua says the Anakim were largely cut off from the hill country, surviving only in places like Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Later, in the stories of David, Gath becomes the home of Goliath and other unusually large warriors. That may be a continuation of the same tradition, or it may show how stories about powerful Philistine champions became attached to older memories of the Anakim. Either way, the biblical world remembers giants not as a single uninterrupted bloodline with documented births and marriages, but as recurring figures at the edge of Israel's story. The pre-flood Nephilim, the Anakim in Canaan, the Rephaim east of the Jordan, Og of Bashan, Goliath of Gath. Different texts, different settings, different purposes, connected by a shared atmosphere of ancient power, danger, and the feeling that the past was larger than the present. And this is where modern claims often go too far. A biblical tradition about giant peoples does not create a traceable genetic line into the modern world. No passage identifies such negative people as descendants of Anakim, Rephaim, or Nephilim. No biblical genealogy follows a special blood trait from Og's kingdom to any living family. No ancient source offers anything remotely like a blood group test. The giant traditions are real as texts. Their impact on religious imagination is enormous. Their historical background may include memories of tall warriors, powerful clans, ruined monuments, and populations remembered as alien or terrifying. But biblical memory is not modern genetics. It can preserve fear. It can preserve names. It can preserve fragments of old conflict. What it cannot do by itself is prove that an ancient giant lineage survives in anyone's veins today. And that brings us to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because among the texts found near Qumran are some of the most dramatic surviving expansions of the giant story ever written. The Dead Sea Scrolls sound like the kind of discovery that should come with a warning label. Ancient manuscripts hidden in desert caves for nearly 2,000 years. Strange religious communities, prophecies, angels, demons, final judgment, lost books, giant offspring of heavenly beings. It is almost impossible not to imagine a single sealed archive containing the secret history nobody wanted the world to see. But that is not what the Dead Sea Scrolls are. And if we want to know what they can genuinely tell us about the Nephilim, we have to start there. The story begins in the late 1940s, when Bedouin shepherds discovered jars containing ancient manuscripts in caves near Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. More discoveries followed. Between 1947 and 1956, researchers found manuscripts and fragments in 11 caves around the site. The collection was enormous, not enormous in the sense that every scroll was perfectly preserved, ready to be unrolled and read from beginning to end. In fact, most of the material survives as fragments, tiny pieces of parchment, faded letters, edges of columns. Sometimes only a few words, sometimes a single word. But taken together, the discoveries transformed the study of the Bible and ancient Judaism. The manuscripts were copied over several centuries, roughly from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century after Christ. That means some were already old when they were hidden in the caves. They come from a period when Jewish life was diverse, politically unstable, and filled with arguments about scripture, purity, angels, temple worship, law, and the approaching end of the age. Most of the scrolls are written in Hebrew. Many are in Aramaic, the everyday language spoken widely across the region in later biblical times. A smaller number are in Greek, and that alone tells us something important. This was not one book, it was a library, a damaged, scattered, incomplete library, but a library nonetheless. Some manuscripts are copies of books that later became part of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Psalms. The book of Isaiah appears in more than one copy. Nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible is represented somewhere among the manuscripts, with the notable exception of Esther. That matters because the Dead Sea Scrolls give us biblical texts more than 1,000 years older than many previously known complete Hebrew manuscripts. They let scholars compare copies, track variations, and see that ancient scribes preserved texts with both remarkable care and occasional differences. But the scrolls also contain writings that are not in most modern Bibles. There are prayers, commentaries, legal rulings, calendars, hymns, rules for community life, apocalyptic visions, retellings of biblical stories, texts about angels, evil spirits, cosmic warfare, and judgment. There are also manuscripts connected to a particular Jewish movement, probably the group that lived at or used Qumran. These writings describe a community that saw itself as separated from a corrupt world. They spoke of themselves as the righteous remnant preparing for divine intervention. They argued fiercely about the proper calendar, the proper priesthood, the proper interpretation of Scripture. But even here caution matters. For decades, people spoke as if every Dead Sea Scroll had been written by one isolated sect, often identified with the Essenes. That remains a major theory. It may be broadly right about some of the material, but the evidence is more complicated than a neat label suggests. The caves contain texts copied by different hands from different times in different literary styles. Some may have belonged to the Qumran community. Some may have come from Jerusalem or other places brought to the region for safekeeping during war and upheaval. So when someone says, the Dead Sea Scrolls say, the first question should be, which scroll? A biblical manuscript? A community rule? An Aramaic tale? A commentary written by one group with a strong theological agenda? Because these texts do not speak with one voice, they argue with each other. They preserve different traditions. They sometimes copy the same text in slightly different forms. They come from a world where Scripture was deeply respected, but where the boundaries of a fixed biblical canon were not yet identical to the boundaries familiar to later Jewish and Christian communities. That does not make them less valuable. It makes them more human. We are not looking at a single coded message dropped into the desert for modern conspiracy hunters to decode. We are looking at the surviving remains of a living religious world. A world of scribes, teachers, priests, rebels, families, readers and communities, trying to understand why evil existed, why Israel suffered, and whether God was about to act. And preservation changes everything. The dry Judean climate preserved parchment and papyrus that would have rotted almost anywhere else. But preservation was never perfect. Some scrolls survived almost intact. Others were shredded by time, insects, handling, moisture, collapse, and the long process of removal from the caves. Imagine trying to reconstruct a novel after someone has torn it into thousands of pieces, scattered them across a floor, and erased half the ink. That is the reality scholars often face. A fragment may contain only a phrase about the giants, but without the lines before and after it, we may not know who is speaking, whether the statement is literal or symbolic, or how the story originally ended. Experts compare handwriting, material, vocabulary, parallel manuscripts, ancient translations, and the placement of every surviving fragment. Even then, some reconstructions remain uncertain. That uncertainty is not a weakness to hide. It is part of the evidence. The scrolls can reveal what ancient Jewish writers believed, imagined, debated, copied, and feared. They can show us that stories about the Watchers and the giants were far more developed in some ancient Jewish circles than the brief passage in Genesis might suggest. They can preserve traditions that later fell outside the biblical canon. But they cannot tell us what modern blood groups meant, because blood groups had not been discovered. They cannot identify Rach-negative people. They cannot provide DNA from Nephilim. And they cannot turn a mythic giant tradition into a documented biological pedigree. The right question is never, can we force the scrolls to confirm a theory? The right question is, what do these ancient texts actually say? And what kind of claim can they support? Because one of them really does take the giant story much further. It is called the Book of Giants, and the Book of Giants does not disappoint. If Genesis gives us a few haunting lines about the Nephilim, the Book of Giants takes those lines and opens them into an entire apocalyptic drama. This text survives among the Dead Sea Scrolls, mainly in Aramaic fragments found in Cave 4 at Qumran. Not one complete scroll, not a clean beginning, middle and end. What survives is more like the wreckage of a lost epic. Pieces of dialogue, names, dreams, warnings, references to destruction. Enough to show us the shape of the story, but not enough to recover every scene with certainty. And the shape is intense. The giants are alive. They are powerful. They are violent. And they are beginning to realize that something is coming for them. The Book of Giants belongs to the wider Enochic tradition, a body of ancient Jewish writings associated with Enoch, the mysterious patriarch from Genesis, who walked with God and was taken away. In these traditions, Enoch is not just a distant ancestor who disappears after a few verses. He becomes a heavenly scribe, a traveller between worlds, a witness to divine secrets, the person who can deliver messages between heaven and earth. That matters because the giants need a messenger. According to the larger Watcher tradition, heavenly beings called Watchers descend to earth. They cross a boundary they were not supposed to cross. They take human wives. Their union produces giant offspring. And those offspring become a disaster for the world. They consume everything: food, land, animals, human life. Ancient versions of the story describe them as beings of overwhelming appetite. When ordinary resources are no longer enough, their violence escalates. They turn against humanity. They shed blood. They corrupt the earth. Now, whether anyone reading this believed these giants were literal biological creatures, symbolic images of violent rulers, or some mixture of myth and memory is harder to know. Ancient texts do not always draw the lines modern readers expect. But the moral point is clear. The giants represent power without restraint, strength without justice, desire without limits, and then the dreams begin. This is where the Book of Giants becomes one of the strangest and most dramatic texts from Qumran. Several giant figures appear by name in the fragments. There are brothers called Ohaya and Haya. There is a giant called Mahaway, sometimes spelled Mahawai, who acts as a kind of messenger. And there are names that seem to echo ancient Mesopotamian traditions, including Gilgamesh. That does not mean the Book of Giants is secretly a historical record of Gilgamesh himself. It shows something more interesting. Jewish writers were drawing from, reshaping, and responding to the larger mythic world of the ancient Near East. These giants have nightmares. Not ordinary nightmares either. Visions of judgment, visions of destruction. One dream appears to involve a vast garden being devastated. Trees are cut down, roots torn out, and only a few are left standing. Another dream speaks in images of water, tablets, and coming ruin. The details are incomplete because the manuscripts are incomplete. Scholars debate exactly how certain fragments fit together. But the overall message is hard to miss. The giants understand that they are under sentence. Imagine being nearly invincible, bigger than everyone around you, feared by humans, born from a union between earth and heaven. For years, maybe generations, you have taken whatever you wanted. Then you wake up from a dream you cannot explain. A dream in which the world you dominate is being swept away. A dream that says your strength will not save you. That is the psychological force of the Book of Giants. It does not just describe monsters attacking the world. It gives the monsters fear. They know something is wrong. They know their fathers, the Watchers, have brought catastrophe. And they suspect that the coming judgment will not spare them. So Mahaway is sent to find Enoch. This is one of those moments where the surviving fragments feel like glimpses through a broken doorway. Mahaway travels to seek the ancient scribe and ask what the dreams mean. Enoch receives divine knowledge and sends back an answer. The giants, the Watchers, and the violent world they created are facing destruction. In other words, the flood is no longer just a flood. It becomes cosmic judgment. The earth has been filled with violence, and the violence has a supernatural origin. The punishment will reach the rebellious Watchers. It will reach their giant children, and it will cleanse a world that has been pushed beyond its limit. But here is where we have to slow down. The Book of Giants is not a complete manuscript discovered in perfect condition. It is reconstructed from fragments. Some fragments are tiny. Some passages overlap with later versions of the story preserved far away, especially in Manichaean texts from centuries later. Those later versions can help scholars recognize themes and possible sequences, but they are not identical to the Aramaic Qumran copies. We cannot simply fill every missing line with whatever we wish the text said. That is how legend becomes misinformation. The honest version is already extraordinary. Ancient Jewish communities preserved a giant tradition far more elaborate than Genesis alone. They told stories of heavenly rebellion, terrifying offspring, prophetic dreams, moral corruption, and a judgment that reaches from heaven to earth. But they did not identify a surviving modern family descended from giants. They did not describe Rach negative blood. They did not list a genetic marker passed down from the Nephilim. And they did not say that unusual human traits prove non-human ancestry. That connection is modern, much, much later than the scrolls themselves. The Book of Giants expands the mythology. It shows that ancient people wrestled with the same questions that still pull at us now. Why is violence so seductive? Where does corruption begin? Can power become so great that it stops seeing other people as human? And what happens when a world built on domination finally reaches its breaking point? But to understand where this giant tradition came from, and why Enoch stands at the centre of it, we have to go deeper into the story of the Watchers. To go deeper into the story of the Watchers, we have to turn to 1 Enoch, especially its oldest major section, usually called the Book of the Watchers. This is where the brief, mysterious passage in Genesis becomes an entire cosmic disaster story. Genesis gives us only a few lines. The sons of God see that human women are beautiful. They take wives, the Nephilim are mentioned, then the flood is coming. That is almost all we get. No names, no mountain, no explanation of what these beings were supposed to be. No detailed account of the giants, no direct statement that they were alien, supernatural hybrids in a modern biological sense, or ancestors of any later population. But 1 Enoch fills in the silence. According to the Book of the Watchers, a group of heavenly beings known as Watchers descend from heaven to earth. They are not ordinary angels delivering messages or guarding nations. They are heavenly sentinels, beings meant to watch over creation. And in this story, they abandon their proper place. They come down on Mount Hermon. That location matters. Mount Hermon stood on the northern edge of the ancient Israelite world, a massive snow-covered mountain associated in later tradition with boundaries, foreign lands and the meeting point between heaven and earth. In 1 Enoch, it becomes the place where the rebellion begins. The Watchers do not descend by accident. They make a decision. Their leader is usually named Semjaza, sometimes rendered Shemihaza. He fears that the others may not go through with the plan. So they swear an oath together. Not one fallen being acting alone, but an entire group binding themselves to a shared transgression. That detail makes the story darker. This is organized rebellion. They take human wives, they have children, and those children become giants. Now picture what this does to the Genesis account. In Genesis, the Nephilim appear almost like a flash of lightning in the middle of a storm. You see them for a second, then they are gone. In 1 Enoch, they are part of a chain reaction. Heavenly beings cross a forbidden boundary. Humanity receives knowledge it was not meant to possess. Giant offspring are born. Violence spreads across the earth. And eventually, the whole world is pushed toward judgment. The giants are not presented as noble secret ancestors. They are not the founders of a hidden royal bloodline. They are a symptom of a world coming apart. 1 Enoch says they grow enormous, consume the labour and food of human beings, and eventually turn violent when ordinary resources can no longer satisfy them. They devour animals, then they attack people. The earth becomes filled with blood and suffering. It is mythic language, absolutely, but it is mythic language aimed at a very human fear. What happens when appetite has no limit? What happens when powerful beings take whatever they want, consume everything around them, and treat ordinary people as raw material? That is the giants' role in the story. They are hunger without restraint, power without conscience, a world where the strong have become so strong that nothing can contain them. And the Watchers bring more than offspring. They bring forbidden knowledge. One figure, often called Azael or Azazel, depending on the manuscript and translation, teaches humans how to make weapons. Swords, knives, shields, armour. He reveals metalworking and the arts of war. Other Watchers teach enchantments, root cuttings, signs in the sky, the movements of the stars, and forms of secret knowledge. The text also criticizes the teaching of ornaments, cosmetics, and beautification to a modern reader that may sound strange beside warfare and violence. But the ancient concern is larger than makeup or jewellery. The issue is knowledge used to manipulate, seduce, dominate, or cross boundaries. The Watchers give human beings tools of power before human beings have the wisdom to use them. Think of it like handing dangerous technology to a society already struggling with greed and violence. The technology itself may be impressive, the knowledge may even be real, but in the story it arrives through rebellion, and it multiplies corruption. That is why one Enoch mattered so much in parts of Second Temple Judaism. This was the period before and during the rise of Christianity, when Jewish communities were wrestling with enormous questions. Why is the world so violent? Why do evil people prosper? Where did forbidden knowledge come from? Why does human history seem contaminated by forces larger than individual choices? The Watcher's story gave them a framework. Evil was not just bad decisions made by isolated people. It was a cosmic crisis. Heaven and earth had been thrown out of order. Corruption had entered history through a violation of boundaries, and Enoch becomes the witness. In Genesis, Enoch is a mysterious figure who walks with God and then is no more. In 1 Enoch, he becomes a scribe of heaven, a receiver of visions, and a messenger between the human world and the divine realm. The Watchers ask him to intercede for them after judgment has been announced, but their request fails. This is crucial. The Watchers may be heavenly beings, but they are not beyond judgment. Their status does not save them. They are condemned, bound, and held for punishment. Their giant children are marked for destruction. The flood becomes the cleansing of a world overwhelmed by violence. And in some Enochic passages, the story goes even further. After the giants die, their spirits become wandering evil spirits. That idea would become deeply influential in later Jewish and Christian traditions about demons. So when we read the Book of Giants from Qumran, we are not looking at an isolated fantasy. We are looking at one part of a much larger Enochic universe, a universe where heavenly rebellion, giant violence, demonic spirits, secret knowledge, and final judgment all connect. But we need to keep one boundary clear. 1 Enoch is ancient religious literature. It preserves the imagination, anxieties, moral arguments, and cosmic worldview of real ancient communities. It is incredibly important for understanding how some Jews in the Second Temple period interpreted Genesis. But it is not biological documentation. It does not contain blood samples. It does not describe chromosomes. It does not identify Rh-negative blood, or any other blood group, as evidence of Watcher or Nephilim descent. The people who wrote and copied these texts had no concept of modern genetics. They understood lineage through ancestry, family, tribe, inheritance, blessing, curse, covenant, and memory. Those are powerful categories, but they are not the same thing as DNA. And that difference matters, because later readers often take an ancient story about forbidden unions and try to force it into modern language about genes and bloodlines. The result can sound convincing, but it asks the text to say something it never says. What 1 Enoch actually gives us is more interesting than a secret medical code. It gives us an expanded explanation for why the flood mattered. In Genesis, the catastrophe arrives quickly. In Enoch, we see the build-up. The oath on the mountain, the forbidden teachings, the birth of the giants, the filling of the earth with violence. Not a clinical history of non-human ancestry, a moral history of a world that has crossed too many lines. And that brings us to the question that sits underneath almost every bloodline theory. If the Qumran texts talk so intensely about corruption, separation, judgment, and the fate of the righteous, could they be preserving a secret idea about biological descent? The answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. The Dead Sea Scrolls do talk about inherited identity. They talk about the people of Israel, the covenant, priestly families, the sons of Aaron, the tribe of Levi, the seed of Abraham, and the faithful remnant living among an unfaithful generation. But the language is not doing what modern readers often assume it is doing. At Qumran, lineage mattered. It mattered deeply, but lineage was not a genetic code in the modern sense. It was a way of locating yourself inside a sacred history. Who are your ancestors? Which tribe do you belong to? Are you part of the priestly line? Do you stand within the covenant given to Israel? Do you live according to its laws? Those questions could determine where a person belonged in society, what roles they could perform, whom they could marry, which obligations they carried, and how the community understood its relationship to God. That is not the same thing as asking what alleles someone inherited, what antigens were present on their red blood cells, or whether a rare blood type pointed to non-human ancestry. The people at Qumran had no concept of genes, no chromosomes, no blood group systems, no Rh factor. They could observe family resemblance, inheritance of property, descent through generations, and perhaps recurring illnesses. But the biological machinery beneath inheritance was invisible to them. So when a scroll speaks about seed, sons, fathers, or a holy lineage, we have to hear those words in their ancient setting. Seed can mean literal descendants. It can also mean a people, a future generation, a covenant community, or those who continue a righteous way of life. And sometimes it is even more symbolic than that. The community rule, one of the best-known texts associated with Qumran, divides humanity into the sons of light and the sons of darkness. That sounds at first like a claim about two separate kinds of humans. But read closely, and the text is describing a moral and cosmic conflict. The sons of light are aligned with truth, humility, righteousness, discipline, and obedience to God's commands. The sons of darkness are aligned with deceit, greed, violence, impurity, and rebellion. Behind this division stand spiritual powers, the Prince of Lights on one side, Belial, the force of wickedness on the other. This is not a blood test, it is an apocalyptic map of the universe. The community believed history was a battlefield. Every act of loyalty, every violation of the law, every instance of injustice, every hidden deception had cosmic weight. Human beings were not simply choosing between good habits and bad habits. They were joining one side or the other in a struggle that reached from earth into heaven. That worldview connects naturally to the Enochic stories of the Watchers. In both traditions, corruption is more than individual failure. It spreads. It contaminates communities. It distorts the order of creation. And it invites judgment. But notice what is being judged. Not a particular blood antigen, not a secret Rh-negative population, not a medically identifiable descendant group. The texts condemn violence, arrogance, false teaching, sexual transgression, unjust wealth, betrayal of covenant, and leaders who misuse authority. The problem is not that ordinary human beings carry the wrong biology. The problem is that the world has become morally disordered. That distinction is easy to lose because ancient texts often describe wrongdoing in physical language. They speak of impurity, defilement, cleansing, separation, a polluted land, a corrupted generation, hearts made crooked, spirits of falsehood, people walking in darkness. To a modern audience, words like contaminated, pure, mixed, or corrupt can sound almost genetic. We live after centuries of biology, heredity, race science, medical testing, and DNA databases. We are trained to hear the body behind every description of descent. But ancient ritual purity is not modern biological purity. Ritual impurity could come from contact with a corpse. Certain bodily conditions, childbirth, skin disease, or prohibited foods. It could be temporary. It could be addressed through washing, waiting, sacrifice, or prescribed rites. It did not mean that someone had bad genes. It did not mean they belonged to an inferior ancestry. And it did not mean their blood was physically contaminated. In fact, a person could be ritually impure without having done anything morally wrong at all. Touching a dead body could make someone impure. So could giving birth. Those realities tell us immediately that ritual categories and moral categories were related, but not identical, and neither one maps cleanly onto genetics. Ethnic identity worked differently too. In Second Temple Judaism, being Israelite-involved ancestry, yes. But it also involved covenant memory, shared law, land, worship, language, kinship, and collective history. A genealogy was not merely a record of biological transmission. It was a claim about belonging. Think of it like this. A modern genetic report might tell you that you share segments of DNA with populations from a particular region. An ancient genealogy tells you who your people are supposed to be, what promises they inherit, what obligations they bear, and where they stand in the story of God and the world. Those are not the same kind of document, and Qumran adds another layer. The community behind many of the scrolls seems to have viewed itself as a faithful remnant. Not necessarily the only Israelites by ancestry, but the group that had correctly understood the covenant in an age of widespread error. They separated themselves from practices they considered corrupt. They followed strict rules of membership, discipline, purity, and interpretation. That separation can sound elitist to modern ears, and in some ways it was. They believed they possessed the right path, while others had gone astray. But even here, membership was not presented as a simple matter of blood. A person entered through instruction, examination, commitment, and communal discipline. There were rules, there were periods of testing, there were consequences for lying, anger, disobedience, and violations of purity. Identity was inherited in one sense, but also performed. It had to be lived. That is a major problem for claims that turn the scrolls into evidence for a hidden genetic caste. The Qumran texts care intensely about identity, but identity for them is layered. There is family descent, there is priestly descent, there is Israelite descent, there is ritual status, there is covenant loyalty, and there is the final division between those judged righteous and those judged wicked. Modern readers can flatten all of that into one word, bloodline. But bloodline is doing too much work. It takes theological language about election and turns it into biology. It takes ritual language about purity and turns it into medical language. It takes cosmic language about light and darkness and turns it into a claim about inherited DNA. And once that happens, almost any ancient phrase can be made to sound like coded genetics. A holy seed becomes a rare allele. A corrupted generation becomes hybrid ancestry. The sons of darkness become a separate biological race. The giants become a vanished species whose traces survive in unusual blood types. It is a dramatic story. It has the shape of a revelation. But the actual texts do not make those connections. What they give us is a much older and, in some ways, more unsettling idea. A society can be corrupted without changing species. A people can inherit traditions of violence, pride, and injustice without inheriting non-human DNA. And judgment in these writings falls not because a population has unusual blood, but because power has broken its moral limits. The scrolls are full of lineages, but they are not maps to the RH factor, and their silence on blood types is not a hidden clue. It is exactly what we should expect from ancient texts written long before anyone knew that human blood could be classified that way. And that last point matters more than it may seem, because when people say the Dead Sea Scrolls will not say it directly, they are making a very specific kind of claim. They are not saying the texts contain evidence, they are saying the evidence is hidden in the silence. Maybe the scribes knew, maybe they were protecting forbidden knowledge. Maybe they used symbolic language because the truth was too dangerous to write openly. Maybe references to seed, purity, giants, angels and sacred descent are supposed to be read as a code for something modern. Mark, Mod, Mark, Mark, Mard, Mark, Mark, Mard, Ma, Mark, Mard, Ma, 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 Ma. It is an intriguing idea. It also has a serious problem. A text cannot conceal a scientific category that did not exist in the intellectual world of its authors. The men who copied and preserved the scrolls knew blood. Of course they did. They saw blood in childbirth, injury, slaughter, hunting, warfare, menstruation, sacrifice, and death. Blood was not an abstract concept to them. It was immediate, powerful, sacred, dangerous. In the biblical world, blood was closely connected with life itself. Leviticus says, "The life of the flesh is in the blood." That was not a laboratory statement about circulation, cells, proteins, or oxygen transport. It was an observation rooted in human experience. When blood pours out, life leaves. When an animal is sacrificed, its blood marks the boundary between ordinary killing and ritual offering. Blood belongs to God because life belongs to God. That idea shaped laws about food, sacrifice, purity, and violence. Blood could be poured out at the altar. It could be forbidden as food. It could cry out metaphorically from the ground as Abel's blood does in Genesis. It could symbolize guilt, innocence, covenant, kinship, or the terrible cost of judgment. And none of that is the same as blood typing. Ancient people could recognize that relatives sometimes looked alike. They knew that families passed down status, property, physical features, and perhaps certain patterns of illness. They knew that blood joined generations in the ordinary sense of descent. A father and son belonged to the same house. A priest belonged to a priestly family. A people traced itself back to ancestors, but they had no way to look inside blood and distinguish one person's red cells from another's. No microscopes. No immunology, no understanding of antibodies, no knowledge that red blood cells carry molecular markers called antigens, no ABO blood groups, no Rh factor. That knowledge arrived astonishingly late. In 1900, the Austrian physician Karl Landsteiner discovered the ABO blood group system after observing that blood from different people could react badly when mixed. Suddenly, doctors had a way to understand why some transfusions killed patients while others succeeded. A few decades later, in 1939 and 1940, researchers identified what became known as the Rh factor, named after early experiments involving rhesus monkeys. That is the scientific world behind the label RHE-ERT. It does not mean a person lacks blood. It does not mean their blood is ancient, alien, pure, cursed, royal, or non-human. In the usual medical meaning, Rh negative refers mainly to the absence of the D antigen on the surface of red blood cells. A tiny molecular difference. Not an ancient secret written in code. And this is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. For the Qumran community, blood language could carry enormous spiritual force. Blood could speak of life. Blood could mark sacrifice. Blood could be connected to ritual boundaries and purification. Bloodshed could mean violence so serious that it polluted the land and summoned divine judgment. For modern medicine, blood can be tested for antigens, antibodies, cells, pathogens, clotting factors, hormones, DNA fragments, and dozens of other measurable features. Same word, completely different framework. Think of it like this. Imagine giving a Dead Sea Scrolls scribe a modern blood bank report. It lists ABO type, Rh status, antibody screen, hemoglobin level, platelet count, and cross-match results. He would recognize the word blood, but the document's actual categories would be incomprehensible. Now reverse the situation. Give a modern hematologist a purity regulation from Leviticus or a sectarian rule from Qumran. They can translate the words, they can identify references to bodily fluids, washing, sacrifice, and exclusion. But they cannot turn ritual purity into a medical diagnosis, because that is not what the text is doing. The categories do not match, and when categories do not match, mystery can become misleading. A phrase like "the scrolls won't say it directly" sounds cautious. It sounds as though the theory is respecting the limits of the evidence, but often it works the other way around. It makes the lack of evidence immune to criticism. If the scrolls mention blood, that becomes a clue. If they mention lineage, that becomes a clue. If they mention giants, that becomes a clue. And if they never mention Rh-negative blood, that too becomes a clue, because supposedly they were hiding it. At that point, there is no possible result that could count against the theory. But that is not how historical reasoning works. Silence can be meaningful sometimes. If a document carefully lists a king's titles, but omits a title found everywhere else, historians may ask why. If a writer describes a ritual in detail, but leaves out a practice expected in that setting, that absence may be worth investigating. But silence only becomes evidence when there is a reason to expect speech. We would expect a modern medical textbook to discuss blood groups. We would expect a hospital record to note RHA status in some circumstances. We would not expect an ancient Jewish religious manuscript from more than 2,000 years ago to explain erythrocyte antigens. Its silence is not suspicious. It is normal. The scrolls cannot directly confirm an Rh-negative Nephilim bloodline, because their authors did not possess the concept of Rh-negative blood. They did not have the tests. They did not have the vocabulary. They did not have the scientific problem that blood typing was created to solve. That does not make the scrolls less fascinating, it makes them more real. They preserve ancient fears about corruption, ancient hopes for judgment, ancient arguments over law and belonging, and some of the most dramatic giant traditions ever written down. But they do not contain a hidden hematology manual waiting for modern readers to decode it. So, if the theory did not begin in Qumran, where did it begin? How did a 20th century medical discovery become attached to biblical giants, fallen angels, royal families, and the idea of a hidden human bloodline? The answer is not one lost manuscript. It is a chain of modern ideas added one link at a time. First came the medical fact. Some people are Rh-negative, meaning their red blood cells lack the D antigen. That fact is real. It has consequences in transfusion medicine and pregnancy. It is measurable. It is inherited. It is not especially mysterious to a hematologist. Then came the ancient story. Genesis mentions the Nephilim in only a few lines. Later Jewish texts, especially one Enoch and the Book of Giants, expanded them into a much larger drama involving watchers, forbidden knowledge, gigantic offspring, violence, corruption, and judgment. That story is real too, in the sense that ancient people wrote it, copied it, debated it, and preserved it. But then a third ingredient entered the picture: alternative history. This is where separate mysteries began getting connected. Rh-negative blood seemed unusual. The Nephilim seemed unusual. Royal families claimed unusual descent. Ancient monuments seemed unusual. Reports of psychic experiences, strange abilities, alien encounters, lost civilizations, and secret societies all seemed unusual. And once enough unusual things are placed in the same room, people begin to assume they must know each other. Picture a table covered with clippings. One article says Rh-negative blood is less common globally than Rh-positive blood. Another discusses the Basque population, often mentioned because Rh-negative blood occurs there at relatively high frequencies. Another tells the biblical story of giants. Another traces European royal genealogies back through legendary ancestors. Another claims that certain people are more intuitive, more spiritually sensitive, or unable to be controlled by ordinary institutions. None of those clippings by themselves establishes a Nephilim bloodline, but arrange them in the right order, add arrows between them, and the pattern can start to feel overwhelming. That is how the theory took shape, not through a single discovery, not through a Dead Sea Scrolls translation, not through a genetic study that identified non-human ancestry in Rh-negative people. It took shape through decades of speculation, popular books, television documentaries, tabloid-style history, early internet forums, conspiracy websites, and now social media videos that can connect 10 claims in 10 minutes. The basic formula was simple. Rh-negative blood is uncommon. The Nephilim were different. Therefore, Rh-negative people may descend from the Nephilim. But that word, therefore, is doing almost all the work, because uncommon does not mean ancient. Ancient does not mean supernatural. And a biblical giant tradition does not become a biological genealogy just because both involve the word blood. Over time, the theory gathered recurring themes. One was European ancestry. Rh-negative blood is found worldwide, but its frequency varies among populations. It is often more common in parts of Europe than in many other regions. That pattern became fertile ground for speculation. Some writers focused on the Basques, an indigenous population of the Western Pyrenees with a distinctive language and complex population history. Others pointed to Celtic regions, Iberian communities, or isolated mountain populations. The leap was always tempting. If a trait is more common in one region, perhaps that region preserved an older people. If that people seem culturally distinctive, perhaps they are descendants of a hidden lineage. If ancient texts speak of giants, angels, or mighty ancestors, perhaps those figures were not stories at all, but memories of that lineage. But population history is not a mystery novel with one culprit. Genes become more or less common for ordinary reasons: migration, isolation, founder effects, genetic drift, and natural selection. A relatively small population can, by chance, pass one genetic variant down at a higher rate than surrounding populations. Over generations, that pattern can become striking. It does not require giants. It does not require fallen angels. It does not require visitors from another planet. Another major theme was royalty. For thousands of years, kings and aristocrats have claimed special ancestry. Some trace themselves to gods, some to heroes, some to biblical patriarchs, Trojan survivors, ancient priests, or legendary founders. Sacred descent gave political power an aura of destiny. It said, in effect, we do not rule merely because we won. We rule because our blood is different. That language was symbolic, political, and sometimes religious. But modern theories often turn it into literal biology. A royal family has an old genealogy, therefore its blood must be unusual. Its blood is unusual, therefore it must be Rh-negative. It is Rh-negative, therefore it may carry Nephilim ancestry. But historical royal genealogies are not clean genetic records. They are full of missing branches, invented ancestors, strategic marriages, adoptions, disputed paternity, and legends written to make a dynasty look older or holier than it really was. And there is no credible evidence that Rh-negative status marks a universal royal bloodline, much less a non-human one. Then there were claims about special abilities. Some versions say Rh-negative people are more intuitive, more empathic, more resistant to hypnosis, more likely to have unusual dreams, psychic experiences, or a feeling that they do not belong here. Other versions claim they have distinctive body temperatures, eye colours, sensitivities, or personalities. These claims can feel deeply personal, especially to people searching for an explanation for experiences that seem hard to describe. But a feeling of difference is not a genetic test. And when a claim is broad enough, almost anyone can recognize themselves in it. People remember the moments that fit. They forget the countless moments that do not. This is one reason personality systems, horoscopes, and conspiracy theories can feel so accurate. They offer a pattern before they offer proof. The Alien Origin version took the same theory even further. Here the Watchers became extraterrestrials. The Nephilim became hybrid beings. Ancient texts became distorted memories of contact with advanced visitors. Rh-negative blood became the surviving biological trace. It is a powerful modern myth because it combines science fiction language with biblical mystery. It turns old stories into cosmic history. It offers an answer to the question, why are humans different from other animals? And it gives certain people a startling role in that answer. Not just human, not just descended from ancestors, descended from something else. But this is precisely where repeated assertion becomes dangerous. A claim appears in one speculative book. A later writer cites it without checking the source. A documentary presents it with dramatic confidence. A website repeats it. A video repeats the website. Comments beneath the video say, "I have heard this before," as though familiarity were confirmation. Soon the claim has been repeated so many times that it feels documented. But repetition is not evidence. It is often just repetition. And this matters because the theory can borrow authority from things that are genuinely real. Rh-negative blood is real. The Dead Sea Scrolls are real. The Book of Giants is real. The Nephilim tradition is real. Ancient royal ideology is real. Population genetics is real. The theory gains force by standing among them, but the bridge connecting them is modern. The Qumran manuscripts do not identify Rh-negative people. They do not say the Nephilim passed down a blood antigen. They do not name European populations as descendants of giants. They do not describe royal families preserving extraterrestrial genetics. They do not test anyone's blood, because no one in the ancient world could have done that. What they preserve is something different. Ancient imagination at work, fear of corrupted lineage, or before beings larger than ordinary humanity. The hope that divine judgment could cleanse a violent world. The belief that ancestry mattered, that communities could be pure or polluted, faithful or rebellious. Those ideas are powerful enough on their own, but modern readers brought Rh-negative blood into the story. Modern readers brought aliens. Modern readers brought secret dynasties, suppressed science, and hidden genetic inheritance. The theory did not emerge from the scrolls. It emerged in the space between old texts and new anxieties, where every unanswered question can begin to look like a door. And one of the oldest doors leads straight into a palace. Because long before anyone knew what a gene was, rulers understood the power of blood. Not blood in the medical sense, not antigens, chromosomes, or inherited variants. Blood as a symbol, blood as continuity, blood as destiny. The idea that a king was not simply a man with soldiers, taxes, and a throne. He belonged to a different order of being. His ancestors reached farther back. His family stood closer to the gods. His right to rule was written into the universe itself. Ancient Egypt offers one of the clearest examples. Pharaohs were presented not merely as political leaders, but as sacred figures linked to divine powers and cosmic order. In Mesopotamia, kings described their authority as granted by heaven. Greek and Roman elites traced their lines to gods and heroes. Roman emperors could claim descent from Venus through the Trojan hero Aeneas. Medieval European dynasties trace themselves to biblical figures, legendary Trojan founders, saints, warrior kings, and ancestors who conveniently appeared just far enough back in time that nobody could question them. This was not a secret genetic program. It was legitimacy. If you ruled a kingdom full of people who had never voted for you, you needed a story bigger than force. You needed to explain why your family and not some other family possessed the right to command armies, collect tribute, make laws, and pass power to children who had done nothing yet to earn it. Sacred ancestry solved that problem. It transformed inheritance into destiny. And once a dynasty says its blood is special, people begin asking what special means. Maybe it means blessed by God. Maybe it means descended from a hero. Maybe it means connected to an ancient priesthood, a lost tribe, a vanished civilization, or a race of beings who once ruled the earth. In modern bloodline theories, that symbolic claim gets translated into biological language. The old royal myth becomes a modern genetic allegation. A family has ancient titles, therefore its ancestry must be extraordinary. Its ancestry is extraordinary, therefore it must preserve rare blood. Its blood is rare, therefore it must be connected to the Nephilim. But that chain breaks at every link. A royal genealogy is not the same thing as a DNA record. This is crucial. Genealogies can document real relationships. Birth records, marriage contracts, wills, church registers, court archives, and modern genetic testing can sometimes establish lines of descent with considerable confidence. Historians do this work carefully, one document at a time. They compare dates, places, names, inheritance patterns, and surviving evidence. And even then, certainty has limits. Go back a few centuries and the records thin out. Go back 1,000 years, and they become tangled with political propaganda. A chronicler writing for a king had every reason to make that king's ancestors look noble, ancient, holy, and unstoppable. Missing links could be invented. Rivals could be erased. A legendary warrior could be attached to a family tree. A dynasty could claim descent from Troy because Troy sounded older and grander than a regional warlord who happened to seize power during a succession crisis. Mythic pedigree is not useless. It tells us what a society valued. It reveals how rulers wanted to be seen, but it cannot be read like a laboratory report. And even a genuinely documented family tree would not prove a hidden biological essence. Every person has an enormous number of genealogical ancestors once you go back far enough. Royal families married within elite circles, yes, sometimes repeatedly. But they were never sealed containers preserving a pure ancient substance. They were human populations moving through history, shaped by marriage, migration, adoption, alliances, illegitimate children, changing borders, and the simple chaos of real life. The fantasy of pure blood is much tidier than history. That is part of its appeal in periods of distrust. Secret bloodline stories become especially powerful. When institutions seem dishonest, when inequality feels permanent, when wealthy families appear insulated from consequences, people look for an explanation. Maybe the powerful are not just protected by money, connections, or inherited status. Maybe they belong to something older. Maybe there's a hidden network beneath the visible one. Maybe the same blood has been directing events for centuries. It is an emotionally satisfying story because it turns confusing systems into intentional design. Instead of asking how power concentrates through property, law, education, influence, and political access, the story offers a simpler answer: blood. Instead of confronting the ordinary machinery of privilege, it imagines an ancient lineage operating behind the curtain. And that idea can become dangerous fast. Claims about hidden descent have often been used to divide people into supposedly superior and inferior groups, to accuse communities of secret control, or to treat ancestry as evidence of moral worth. None of that follows from genetics, none of it follows from history. And none of it is supported by Rach negative blood. Rh-negative status occurs in people from many families, regions, and backgrounds. It is not a crown mark. It is not proof of royal descent. It is not evidence that anyone carries the legacy of Nephilim watchers or some hidden non-human ancestor. But the desire behind the claim is ancient. People want to know why some families rule. They want to know whether history is random or guided. They want to believe the world's deepest hierarchies have an explanation, even if that explanation is dark. And now the question becomes more concrete. If royal myth cannot prove a hidden bloodline, can modern genetics recover one? Modern genetics can recover things that would have looked impossible just a generation ago. A tooth from a cave floor, a fragment of bone from a burial disturbed thousands of years ago. A tiny piece of the dense bone behind the human ear, protected deep inside the skull. From material like this, scientists can sometimes reconstruct parts of a person's genome. They can identify biological sex, estimate family relationships, trace broad population movements, detect genetic links between ancient communities and people living today. They can show that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. They can reveal migrations no written source remembered. That is real. It is extraordinary. And it is exactly why ancient DNA gets pulled into stories about lost bloodlines. Because once you hear that DNA can survive for thousands of years, the next question seems obvious. Could scientists test an ancient giant burial? Could they find an Rh-negative marker? Could they compare it to modern families, and finally prove that some people carry Nephilim blood? This is where the power of genetics has to be separated from the fantasies built around it. Ancient DNA is not a perfect recording preserved inside old bones. It is usually damaged, fragmented, incomplete, and mixed with DNA from everything that touched the remains after death. Bacteria, fungi, soil organisms, excavators, museum workers. Modern humans who handled the bones long before anyone imagined genetic testing. Time is not kind to DNA. Heat destroys it. Water destroys it. Repeated freezing and thawing destroys it. Warm, humid environments are especially brutal. A human body buried in a cold, dry cave may preserve usable genetic material for tens of thousands of years. A body buried in a hot, wet landscape may leave almost nothing after a much shorter time. The ancient Near East has produced important DNA studies, but preservation is uneven. Many remains simply cannot provide a usable genome, and even when DNA survives, contamination is a constant threat. Imagine trying to reconstruct an ancient manuscript after it has been soaked, torn into thousands of strips, scattered across a dirty floor, and mixed with pages from other books. That is closer to the reality of ancient DNA than the clean laboratory image most people have in mind. Scientists look for chemical patterns of ancient damage. They use sterile procedures. They compare genetic signatures. They test results repeatedly, but every claim has to survive that process. Then there is the problem of sample size. One skeleton is one person. Even a perfectly sequenced ancient genome cannot tell us what an entire people believed, how common a trait was, or whether a whole population descended from some mysterious group. It can tell us about that individual and, with careful comparison, about their likely relationship to other sampled populations. To make broader claims, researchers need many individuals from different sites, different time periods, and different social contexts. And ancient burials are not just scientific objects waiting to be opened. They are human remains. They may belong to communities with living descendants, religious traditions, or cultural claims connected to the dead. Some groups welcome genetic research. Others oppose destructive sampling. Some demand consultation, reburial, or control over how the data is used. Those concerns are not obstacles to science. They are part of doing science responsibly. So where does Rh-negative blood fit into all this? The Rh system involves several genes, especially the RhD gene, which is associated with the D antigen that determines whether someone is called Rh positive or Rh negative. In many European populations, Rh-negative status is often linked to the absence of a functioning RhD gene. But the genetics are more complicated than one simple missing switch. Different variants can affect Rh status. The same blood type label does not automatically point to one ancient event, one place, or one ancestral people. Finding an Rh-related variant in ancient DNA would be interesting. It could help researchers study how common certain variants were in a particular population at a particular time. It might contribute to a larger picture of migration, ancestry, and genetic diversity. But it would not prove Nephilim descent. That leap would require evidence that does not exist. To prove an extraordinary historical claim, you would need far more than a rare trait appearing in an ancient person. You would need a clearly identified population, securely dated remains, a large number of samples, reproducible genetic patterns, a demonstrated biological distinction from ordinary human variation, independent evidence from archaeology, history, and ancient texts all pointing in the same direction. And even then, genetics could establish biological relationships. It could show that one group was related to another, or that a population carried unusual variants, or that people from distant regions mixed and had children. It could not confirm supernatural ancestry. DNA can tell us whether ancient people were human relatives of other humans. It can reveal admixture between populations. It can uncover branches of the human family tree that were once invisible, but descended from divine beings is not a genetic category. Nephilim blood is not a known biological marker. There is no verified Nephilim genome sitting in a laboratory somewhere, waiting for comparison. Without a reference sample, the claim cannot even begin in the way geneticists normally test ancestry, and that is the central limit. Ancient DNA can answer questions grounded in material evidence. Who was related to whom? Where did populations move? Which communities mixed? What traits may have existed in the past? It cannot turn a theological or mythological figure into a confirmed biological population just because a modern story wants it to. But genetics has still given us something remarkable. It has shown that the human past was far stranger, more interconnected and more mobile than old textbooks imagined. Real ancient people crossed continents, met distant populations, exchanged genes, languages, tools, and stories. The truth is already astonishing. The danger begins when that astonishment is used to smuggle myth in through the laboratory door. And that is where a fascinating question can become a dangerous one. Because blood has never been just blood in human imagination. For thousands of years, people have treated it as identity made visible. Blood meant family, tribe, inheritance, loyalty, purity, guilt, royal descent, sacred obligation. To say that people shared blood was to say they belonged together. To say they had different blood was often a way of saying they did not. Then modern science arrived and suddenly blood could be tested. In the early 20th century, researchers discovered the ABO blood groups. Later came the Rh system and many others. This was a major medical breakthrough. Blood typing made transfusion safer. It helped doctors understand pregnancy complications. It gave scientists new tools for studying population history. But almost immediately, people began trying to turn those tools into maps of human value. They measured blood group frequencies in different populations. They noticed that some blood types were more common in some regions than others. Type B, for example, had different patterns across Eurasia than type O. Rh-negative blood appeared at different rates in different populations, with relatively high frequencies in parts of Europe and lower frequencies in many other regions. Those observations were real. The conclusions people built from them were often not. Some writers claimed blood groups revealed pure races. Others claimed they proved ancient racial invasions, superior lineages, hidden peoples, or permanent biological divisions between nations. Political movements looking for scientific cover took these ideas and pushed them even further. In the worst cases, biology was twisted into a language of exclusion. Human beings were ranked. Communities were labelled impure. Families were persecuted because someone decided their ancestry made them a threat. The science did not create that hatred, but bad science gave hatred a costume. It made prejudice sound technical, and blood was perfect for the role. It was invisible inside the body, mysterious to most people, and deeply connected to birth, family, and survival. If someone could claim to identify a special bloodline, they could claim to identify a special destiny. They could tell people that history had chosen them, or that history had marked someone else as less human. That is the road every bloodline theory has to be careful not to walk down. Because genetic differences are real, nobody needs to pretend otherwise. Human populations have histories. People migrated, mixed, became separated, adapted to local environments, and came together again. Some genetic variants became more common in certain places through chance, natural selection, founder effects, and the complicated mathematics of inheritance. But variation is not hierarchy. A genetic variant can tell us something about ancestry. It might hint at a population history. It may affect a medical trait. It can sometimes help explain why one group has a higher frequency of a certain condition than another. It cannot tell us who matters more. It cannot tell us who is spiritually superior. It cannot tell us who is closer to God, more ancient, more legitimate, more intelligent, more dangerous, or more deserving of power. And it certainly cannot divide humanity into people with ordinary origins and people with some secret, exalted, or cursed biological source. Think about what the Nephilim theory is really asking us to believe. Not just that an ancient text contains a mystery. Not just that the Nephilim were remembered in strange and dramatic stories. It asks us to look at living people with a particular medical trait and imagine that their bodies carry evidence of a separate and extraordinary inheritance. That can sound harmless when it is presented as a late-night mystery, a hidden truth, a forbidden bloodline. But ideas do not stay harmless just because they begin as entertainment. The moment a story says that some modern people may be biologically different in a profound way, it can attract all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons. Some will feel special, some will feel afraid, some will start searching for villains, some will use the theory to reinforce old ideas about ethnic purity, royal descent, chosen peoples, conspiracies, or racial destiny. And once that happens, evidence becomes inconvenient. A complicated genetic pattern gets simplified into a badge. A blood type becomes an identity. An ancestry estimate becomes a claim about essence. A religious story becomes a biological weapon. That is biological mythmaking. It takes the language of genes, chromosomes, and blood antigens, then uses it to build a story science cannot support. The story may feel ancient. It may sound mysterious. It may even borrow real facts along the way. But a few real facts do not make the final conclusion true. Rh-negative blood is real. The Nephilim are real as figures in ancient texts and later traditions. The Dead Sea Scrolls are real. Ancient populations did mix. Blood groups do vary in frequency around the world. None of that creates a bridge from a modern blood test to supernatural ancestry. And language matters here. It matters when we say ethnicity, because ethnicity is not simply DNA. It includes culture, language, history, community, and self-identification. It matters when we say ancestry, because ancestry is tangled. Every person has countless ancestors, not one clean line stretching back through time. It matters when we say religion, because sacred texts speak in genres that include poetry, law, prophecy, vision, and mythic tradition. They are not modern genetic reports, and it matters when we say heredity. A trait can be inherited without carrying a message about who someone is. A person may inherit an arch-negative blood type, curly hair, lactose intolerance, a risk for a disease, or a genetic connection to populations that lived thousands of years ago. None of these things determine their character. None of them assign a cosmic role. None make them less human or more human than anyone else. This does not mean we have to kill every mystery. We can still ask why giant traditions appear in so many cultures. We can study how ancient communities understood descent, corruption, angels, heroes, and monstrous beings. We can investigate population history with genetics. We can examine old theories and ask why they became persuasive. We can remain open to discoveries that challenge what we think we know. But being open-minded is not the same as accepting every claim. Real inquiry has rules. It asks what the evidence actually says. It notices what is missing. It changes course when a theory fails. And it refuses to turn uncertainty into permission to degrade living people. Because the most important fact about human blood may be the simplest one. Whatever our blood type, whatever our ancestry, whatever stories our ancestors told about giants and angels and ancient kings, we are one human species, deeply varied, deeply interconnected, and far more alike than the myths of pure blood ever wanted us to believe. So if there is a historical memory behind the stories of giants, where should we look for it? Not in a modern blood type treated like a supernatural fingerprint. We have to look somewhere more complicated. Somewhere human. Somewhere human. That does not mean the giant traditions are simple. It does not mean somebody saw a tall man once, and over time turned him into a monster. Ancient stories are rarely that neat. They grow in layers. A memory of a real person can merge with a sacred warning. A ruined city can become the work of an earlier race. A powerful enemy can become larger than life, first in reputation, then in poetry, then finally in body. But yes, there could be historical memories behind some giant traditions. Just not historical memory in the modern sense. Not a preserved documentary record, passed down accurately for thousands of years. More like an ember carried through generations. Real experiences, real places, real fears, transformed every time someone retold the story. Start with the most obvious possibility. Human beings vary dramatically in height. Most people in an ancient farming community may have been relatively short by modern standards, especially in periods of poor nutrition, disease, and hard physical labour. A man who stood far above everyone around him could become unforgettable. Even today, exceptionally tall people attract attention. In a world without photography, medical categories, or statistics, that attention could easily become legend. And there are real medical conditions that can produce extraordinary height, including gigantism and acromegaly. These conditions are rare. They do not explain an entire people of giants. But a rare person does not have to be common to become culturally important. One unusually large warrior, ruler, wrestler, or outsider could become the centre of a story that outlived his name. Then the story begins to move. Maybe he was not merely tall. Maybe he was the tallest man anyone had ever seen. A generation later, he becomes taller than a doorway. A few generations after that, he is wearing armour no ordinary man could lift. He is fighting 10 men at once. He is descended from an ancient people who lived before the flood. And eventually, the story is no longer really about his height at all. It is about power, danger, the terrifying idea that the world once contained beings stronger than us. This is what oral tradition does, not because people are foolish, because stories are built to survive. A precise measurement is fragile. It dies with the person who recorded it, but an image survives. He was unusually tall becomes he was like a giant. He was a terrifying enemy becomes our people felt like grasshoppers beside him. That language may not be intended as a literal physical report. It may be the language of fear, humiliation, military defeat, or religious warning. When people describe an enemy as enormous, they can be describing what it felt like to face him. And ancient texts do this constantly. Kings are called lions. Armies become floods. Cities reach the heavens. Heroes perform feats beyond ordinary human ability. This does not automatically mean the writers were trying to deceive anyone. It means they were writing in a world where symbolic language, epic memory, and historical experience could exist together in the same story. There is another possibility too. Ruins. Imagine living in a small village and encountering the remains of a massive wall, a stone tomb, a fortress gate, or an abandoned city built centuries before your own time. The stones are enormous. The builders are gone. Nobody remembers exactly who made it or how. What do you call the people who could move blocks that large? You call them giants. Across the ancient world, later populations looked at older monuments and wondered about the people behind them. Megalithic tombs, cyclopean walls, enormous burial mounds, ruined palaces, and collapsed temples all invite the same question. Who could have built this? Sometimes archaeology gives us an answer. Often it does not. But before archaeology, imagination filled the gap. In Greek tradition, huge ancient walls could be called cyclopean, as if only one-eyed giants could have assembled them. In many parts of Europe, prehistoric monuments became associated with giants, fairies, legendary kings, or supernatural builders. Similar patterns appear far beyond Europe. Monumental ruins make the past feel physically larger than the present. And when the past feels larger, its people can become giants. The biblical world had this experience too. The landscapes of the Levant contained ancient cities, massive fortifications, burial structures, and traces of peoples whose histories were only partly remembered. Biblical traditions preserve names for old populations: Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim. These names appear in contexts involving territory, warfare, ancestry, and memory. Sometimes they are associated with great size, sometimes with ancient dead warriors or peoples of an earlier age. But the texts do not give us a simple ethnographic file labeled giant population. They give us traditions shaped by theology and politics as much as by geography. A people described as giant-like can be a remembered enemy. It can be a way of explaining imposing ruins. It can be a literary symbol of the impossible obstacle standing between Israel and the land it believes God promised. It can be all of these at once. And that is the important point. Historical questions and theological questions are not identical. The historical question asks, what experiences, people, places, conflicts, or memories may have contributed to this tradition? The theological question asks, what does the tradition mean? What does it say about human violence, rebellion, divine judgment, fear, faithfulness, or the limits of human power? The mythic question asks something different again. Why do cultures imagine a world before the present world? Why do they tell stories of ancient beings who were greater, stranger, more violent, and closer to the boundary between heaven and earth? You do not have to choose only one of those questions. A believer may read the Nephilim story as a record of real supernatural events. Another reader may see it as theological literature, using ancient mythic imagery to make a claim about corruption and judgment. A historian may look for echoes of warriors, remembered peoples, regional folklore, and monumental landscapes. These approaches can disagree, but they are not all trying to do the same job. The problem starts when one kind of reading pretends to be another. If someone says this story has a possible historical root that does not prove every later detail happened exactly as told, a real tall warrior does not prove a race of hybrid giants. An ancient ruin does not prove supernatural builders. A cultural memory of conflict does not prove that modern people carry Nephilim DNA. And a powerful sacred story does not become stronger when we force it to answer questions it was never written to answer. Still, there is something almost more interesting in the human explanation, because it means giant traditions may preserve the emotional archaeology of the past. Not clean facts, not measurements, but impressions that mattered enough to survive. The fear of a stronger enemy, the awe of standing beneath impossible stones, the memory of an older people, the feeling that the world before us was wilder, more dangerous, and closer to the divine. That kind of memory can travel a very long way. It can cross languages, empires, religions, entire civilizations, and by the time it reaches a text like Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 1 Enoch, or the Book of Giants, it may have become something much bigger than whatever started it. Not evidence of a secret bloodline, but evidence of what human beings do with the past. And that brings us to the hardest part of this entire story. How do you take the mystery seriously without turning every gap in the evidence into proof? Because the gaps are real, the Nephilim appear in only a few biblical passages. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve dramatic traditions about watchers, giant offspring, dreams, violence, judgment, and a world pushed toward destruction. Rh negative blood has unusual medical importance, especially in pregnancy. Ancient DNA has revealed human populations we never knew existed until a few decades ago. Neanderthals were real. Denisovans were real. Ancient people did interbreed. The past is stranger than earlier generations imagined. So it is understandable that people start connecting dots. Ancient giants, mysterious blood, lost lineages, secret descent. But connecting dots is not the same thing as drawing a map. Start with what we actually know. Rh-negative blood is a normal human blood type variation. More precisely, it usually means a person does not have the Rhd antigen on their red blood cells. It is inherited through ordinary human genetics. The exact frequencies differ across populations, with higher rates in some European populations and lower rates in many others. That pattern tells us about ancestry, population history, migration, and genetic drift. It does not point to a separate species. It does not require a non-human ancestor. And it does not identify a hidden ancient bloodline. The pregnancy issue is real too. An Rh-negative mother carrying an Rh-positive fetus can, under certain conditions, produce antibodies that threaten a later Rh-positive pregnancy. Before modern medicine, this could be dangerous. Today, doctors can usually prevent the problem with a well-understood treatment. It feels mysterious because the immune system is doing something dramatic. A mother's body can react to fetal blood cells that carry an antigen she lacks. But unusual is not unexplainable. The immune system reacts to foreign antigens all the time. That is what it evolved to do. Rh incompatibility is medically significant. It is not biologically impossible, and it is not evidence that Rh-negative women are descendants of beings outside the human family. Now look at the texts. Genesis gives us a short, difficult passage about the Nephilim, the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the mighty figures of old. Numbers remembers the Nephilim again in the fearful report of the spies. Deuteronomy and other biblical passages preserve traditions about Anakim, Rephaim, and ancient peoples associated with great size, old territory, and terrifying strength. Then the Second Temple period takes these fragments and expands them. 1 Enoch tells a much larger story about rebellious watchers, forbidden knowledge, giant offspring, escalating violence, and divine judgment. The Book of Giants, preserved in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, gives the giants names, nightmares, anxieties, and a sense that they are living under an approaching sentence. That is all fascinating. But none of these texts describes blood groups. None says that the Nephilim carried a distinct inherited blood factor. None gives a recognizable medical description of Rh incompatibility. None identifies a surviving population by its blood. None says that people with a particular trait, thousands of years later, descend from giants or watchers. And that silence matters, not because silence proves the opposite. Silence rarely proves anything by itself, but because a claim this specific needs evidence that is equally specific. If someone claims modern Rh-negative people descend from a Nephilim bloodline, there has to be a bridge between two very different kinds of evidence. On one side, you have ancient religious literature, symbolic, theological, poetic, and often difficult to interpret even on its own terms. On the other side, you have modern immunohematology, blood antigens, inheritance patterns, population frequencies, and clinical medicine. The proposed bridge is missing. We do not have an ancient Nephilim body. We do not have Nephilim DNA. We do not have an ancient text connecting giant traditions to Rh status. We do not have a genetic mechanism that turns absence of the D antigen into evidence of supernatural ancestry. We do not have a historical chain showing this trait passing from a named ancient group into specific modern families. Without that bridge, the theory remains a story built from resemblance and possibility, not demonstrated connection. And this does not kill the mystery. It just puts the mystery in the right place. The mystery is why these ancient stories became so powerful, why Genesis preserves such a compressed and haunting reference, why later Jewish writers imagined the giants in such elaborate detail, why people across cultures remember ancient beings who were larger, stronger, older, and somehow closer to heaven or disaster than ordinary humans. The mystery is also in the human past itself. Ancient DNA has already taught us that our family tree was not simple. Human populations split, migrated, mixed, vanished, and left fragments of themselves in living people. Future discoveries may reveal new populations, new migrations, new contacts, and new ways that ancient communities understood identity and descent. But future evidence has to do real work. If a new manuscript is discovered, ask what it actually says. Is the translation secure? Is the date known? Is it a first-hand source, a later commentary, or a modern reconstruction built from damaged fragments? If a genetic claim appears, ask what was tested. Is there a peer-reviewed study? Is the sample ancient, authenticated, and compared with appropriate populations? Does the finding show a real genetic relationship, or just a trait that people have decided must mean something extraordinary? And if someone says, science cannot explain this, ask a simpler question. Cannot explain it yet? Or has it already been explained, and the explanation just feels less dramatic than the legend? Because the truth does not become boring when we remove a weak claim. Sometimes it becomes more astonishing. A tiny variation in a blood antigen can shape pregnancies, medical care, family histories, and identity. A few cryptic lines in Genesis can inspire centuries of interpretation. Broken scroll fragments from caves near the Dead Sea can preserve a forgotten world of angels, giants, judgment, and cosmic rebellion. Those things are real enough. They do not need to be fused into one secret genealogy to matter. And once we stop demanding that the evidence confirm every modern theory, we can finally see what the scrolls actually reveal and what they leave unanswered. What the scrolls reveal is not a coded medical record. They do not reveal an Rh-negative bloodline. They do not identify a surviving Nephilim population hidden inside modern humanity. They do not contain a forgotten description of blood antigens, fetal-maternal incompatibility, or a biological marker passed down from watchers and giants. That is not because the scribes at Qumran were hiding the answer. It is because blood types, as modern medicine understands them, were not part of the ancient world's vocabulary. The Rh factor would not be discovered until 1940. The people who copied these manuscripts knew blood as life, sacrifice, kinship, purity, danger, and covenant. They knew that family lines mattered. They knew that ancestry could shape identity. But they did not know red cell antigens, immune sensitization, dominant inheritance, or population genetics. So when modern readers open the Book of Giants and look for Rh-negative blood, they are bringing a 20th century medical question into an ancient religious text. And that matters, because the Book of Giants is dramatic enough without making it say something it never says. In its surviving fragments, the giants are not clinical specimens. They are characters in a cosmic crisis. They dream terrifying dreams. They seek interpretation. They fear judgment. Around them stands a universe where rebellion in heaven has spilled into violence on earth, where corruption has become so deep that destruction is coming. That is what the text is trying to explain. Why is the world broken? Why does violence spread? Why do humans suffer beneath forces larger than themselves? Why does judgment come, and can anyone escape it? These are theological questions, moral questions, questions about power, disorder, and the consequences of crossing boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. One Enoch pushes the same story even further. The Watchers descend. Forbidden knowledge enters the human world. The giant offspring become symbols of appetite without limit, strength without restraint, power without wisdom. Whether ancient readers took every detail literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, the message is clear. There are kinds of knowledge that can corrupt. There are forms of power that consume the world around them. And there are actions whose consequences outlive the people who committed them. That is a very different claim from saying modern people with a particular blood type descend from supernatural beings. But it is also why the connection feels so tempting. People do not just want a blood test result, they want a story. They want to know whether an unusual trait means they belong to something older, deeper, stranger than ordinary history. They want to imagine that the feeling of being different might have an explanation written into the distant past. A lost royal line. A sacred inheritance. A memory carried through generations. Maybe even a trace of a world that existed before the flood. And honestly, that desire is deeply human. Ancient people cared about descent too. They preserved genealogies. They traced tribes, priestly families, royal houses, and covenant communities. In a world where identity could determine land, status, marriage, ritual duty, and belonging, ancestry was never just a list of names. It was destiny, responsibility, and hope. We still feel that pull. Modern genetics gives us percentages, migrations, shared ancestors, and populations that mixed thousands of years ago. Ancient texts give us giants, angels, kings, curses, covenants, and forgotten names. Put those two worlds beside each other, and it is easy to feel that there must be one final secret connecting everything. Maybe that is the real power of this story. Not that the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the RH Nephilim theory. They do not. But they remind us that people have always looked at human difference and asked where it came from. They have always wondered whether blood carries more than biology, whether ancestry carries more than names, whether the past is still alive inside us in ways we cannot see. Sometimes the answer is yes. Ancient DNA really does preserve traces of vanished populations. People alive today really do carry inherited variations, shaped by migration, isolation, selection, and chance. Ancient stories really can preserve memories of places, conflicts, peoples, and fears that would otherwise have disappeared. But a real possibility is not the same thing as a proven conclusion. The scrolls leave many things unanswered. We do not know exactly how every ancient community understood the Nephilim. We do not know how widely the Book of Giants was read, or how its lost passages might have changed our understanding. We do not know every source behind the giant traditions, every story told around fires, every belief that vanished before it reached parchment. And we do not know what future archaeology and genetics may uncover. There may be lost manuscripts still waiting in caves, collections, or forgotten archives. There may be ancient populations we have not yet identified. There may be surprising connections in human history that nobody has recognized yet. But if those discoveries come, they will need to speak for themselves. Not through wishful translation. Not through a viral claim. Not through the pressure to make every mystery prove the most dramatic theory possible. The best way to approach the Nephilim, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Reich. Negative blood is to hold two things together at the same time: curiosity and evidence. Curiosity keeps us asking. It keeps us reading the fragments, studying the genes, questioning the easy answers, and admitting that the ancient world was more complicated than we once believed. Evidence keeps us honest. It tells us what a text actually says, what a genetic trait actually means, and where the line stands between documented history and modern speculation. You do not have to choose between wonder and truth. The deeper kind of wonder begins when you let the evidence be as strange, limited, beautiful, and unfinished as it really is. If you enjoyed this journey into the scrolls, the giants, and the bloodline question, kindly like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves ancient mysteries. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The Spotify link is in the description.